Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was driving through western Kansas when this happened. I'd been on the road most of the day heading toward Denver for work, and by the time it got dark, I was exhausted enough that I stopped at a roadside motel outside Colby instead of trying to push farther west. It was one of those old single-story motels shaped like a long rectangle with all the room doors facing the parking lot. Neon vacancy sign buzzing near the highway. Ice machine beside the office. A couple trucks parked near the far end. Nothing unusual. The weather had been strange all evening. Warm wind despite it being late November, and low clouds moving fast enough to cover the moon every few minutes. You could hear semis constantly from the interstate behind the motel. I checked in around 10:30 p.m. The woman at the desk looked half asleep and barely spoke except to mention the ice machine was outside near room 3. My room sat near the back corner facing open fields beyond the highway. I ate takeout, watched TV for a while, and eventually realized I forgot to grab ice for a drink. That detail sticks with me because if I hadn't wanted ice, none of this would have happened. It must have been around 12:15 when I stepped outside with the plastic ice bucket. The first thing I noticed was how bright the parking lot looked. Not brightly lit exactly, just wrong. The motel parking lot usually had that normal yellow-orange lighting from sodium lamps, but now everything outside looked washed pale white instead. Even the shadows looked faded. I stopped outside my room trying to understand what I was seeing. At first I thought maybe fog had rolled in and was diffusing the lights somehow, but there wasn't any fog. The air looked perfectly clear. The white glow seemed to come from everywhere at once. The motel sign still glowed red near the road, but dimly, almost drowned out by this pale light covering the parking lot. I remember looking up, expecting to see floodlights or maybe headlights from a truck. Nothing. Clouds moved slowly overhead, but the glow didn't seem connected to the sky either. It just existed around the motel. Then I realized something else. The highway noise was gone. Completely. No semis, no tires, nothing. That immediately unsettled me because the interstate sat maybe a quarter mile away. Even at night, you constantly heard traffic. I stood there listening harder. The buzzing from the motel lights was gone too. Even the old ice machine compressor had stopped humming. The entire world outside had gone silent. Not quiet, silent. I could still hear myself breathing and shifting my shoes on concrete, but beyond that there was absolutely nothing. No wind either. The warm air hung completely still around the parking lot. I remember saying hello out loud without thinking. My voice sounded wrong immediately. Muffled somehow, like speaking inside at a heavily carpeted room. I started walking toward the ice machine anyway because my brain kept trying to force normal explanations onto everything. Power outage maybe, hearing issue, exhaustion from driving, but the lights were still on. Every motel window glowed dimly behind curtains. The white light reflected off parked cars strangely too, softly, no sharp edges. The farther I walked from my room, the stranger the parking lot looked. The trucks parked near the far end seemed slightly blurred around the edges, not visually distorted exactly, more like depth perception stopped working properly. I remember noticing there were no insects near the lights either. Usually around motel lamps you'd see moths or bugs swarming. Nothing moved. Halfway to the ice machine, I got the feeling someone else was outside with me. I can't explain why. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't see movement. But suddenly, I became intensely aware of the dark spaces between parked vehicles, like someone standing just out of sight watching me cross the lot. I turned around twice, checking behind me. Nobody there. Every motel room curtain remained closed. The ice machine sat beside the office under its own little overhang light. The light above it had dimmed almost completely now. I could barely make out the machine itself against the pale glow surrounding everything else. That was when I noticed the shadow. Not a person exactly, more like movement crossing slowly behind the office windows. I froze. The office should have been empty at that hour except for the woman at the desk. But whatever moved didn't look like somebody walking naturally. It passed too smoothly across the blinds, then disappeared. The silence remained absolute. I suddenly realized I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore either. I looked down while walking and watched my boots hit wet pavement silently. That scared me more than anything up to that point. I stopped immediately. The ice bucket hung from my hand, dripping condensation onto the concrete. I remember my heartbeat sounding unusually loud in my ears because literally nothing else existed outside that sound. Then came the light. Not the glow covering the parking lot. A separate light. Farther out beyond the motel near the edge of the empty fields. Soft white, low to the ground. At first, I thought it was another car approaching from the frontage road, but it didn't move like headlights. It hovered maybe 20 feet above the grass behind the motel, oval-shaped, faint around the edges. No beam, no flashing, just hanging there, motionless. I stared at it long enough that my eyes started watering. Something about focusing directly on it felt difficult. The shape kept blurring slightly whenever I tried concentrating on details. The pale glow across the parking lot brightened subtly then, not dramatically, just enough that all the motel windows reflected white. I became aware of vibration next. Very faint, not through the air, through the ground, like distant industrial machinery operating miles underground. The ice bucket trembled slightly in my hand. I remember backing away instinctively while staring toward the field. The oval glow remained fixed in place, but the vibration grew stronger. I could feel it through my shoes now. The motel itself looked wrong suddenly. The walls too bright. The parked cars too still. At one point, I noticed a curtain inside one room hanging outward unnaturally, as if frozen mid-movement. I know that sounds impossible, but that's honestly how it looked. Like the entire parking lot had paused somehow. Then I realized something even stranger. The ice inside my bucket had stopped clattering together. I looked down. Water dripped steadily through my fingers from the handle. The ice had partially melted already. That made no sense because I hadn't even reached the machine yet. I hadn't filled the bucket. I was still carrying the empty bucket from my room. For a second, I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. Then I noticed water inside it, half-melted ice cubes sitting in the bottom. I stared at them completely confused because I had no memory whatsoever of using the machine. The vibration deepened suddenly. My vision blurred slightly around the edges, and the oval light beyond the field shifted position without moving. That's the closest description I can give. 1 second, it hovered near the grass. The next, it seemed closer to the motel, not traveling through space, just suddenly nearer. I backed away faster after that, still unable to hear anything except my own breathing. The white glow covering the lot intensified enough that the motel sign near the road disappeared completely into brightness. Then, all at once, sound returned. Violently. Highway traffic exploded back into existence. Wind hit the parking lot hard enough to shake loose gravel. The ice machine beside me roared loudly. Somewhere a dog barked from another building. I actually stumbled because the sudden noise felt physically painful. The normal yellow parking lot lights had returned too. Everything looked ordinary again. The white glow over the field was gone. I stood beside the ice machine soaked with melted water running down my wrist. That's when I finally looked carefully at the bucket. It was completely full of water and half-melted ice. I checked my phone immediately. 1:02 a.m. I stared at the screen because there was absolutely no way I'd spent nearly 45 minutes walking across a motel parking lot. Back in the room, I dumped the water into the sink and realized my hands were shaking badly. The TV was still on exactly where I left it. But the weirdest detail came later. My room keycard no longer worked. Not just demagnetized. Dead completely. The front desk woman had to reprogram it the next morning. When I mentioned the parking lot lights acting strange overnight, she looked at me oddly and said the power hadn't flickered once. Then she asked why I'd been standing outside near the field so long around midnight. I asked what she meant. She told me she'd seen me through the office window while balancing receipts. Said I'd been standing perfectly still in the middle of the parking lot holding the ice bucket for almost half an hour, facing the empty field behind the motel. I used to take Quarry Road home whenever I worked late in Millerton. It shaved maybe 15 minutes off the drive compared to the highway, and after midnight, there was never anybody out there anyway. Just old mining land, abandoned equipment, and miles of gravel road cutting through the hills. Most people avoided it because of deer or because the road washed out during storms, but I liked it. Quiet. No traffic. This happened in early October during a stretch of weird weather where the days stayed hot, but the nights dropped cold fast. That night, there'd been a light rain earlier, and the roads still smelled damp. Fog sat low in certain spots, especially near the quarry pit itself. I got off work around 11:30 p.m. I remember checking the clock in my truck because I'd stayed later than I wanted helping lock up inventory. My manager, Caleb, joked that I'd probably hit another raccoon on Quarry Road because apparently I had terrible luck with animals out there. I stopped for gas and a drink before heading out of town. Everything felt normal for most of the drive. The first strange thing was how loud the insects were. That road always had constant noise at night in early fall. Crickets, frogs, cicadas, sometimes so loud you could hear them through closed windows. About halfway down Quarry Road, I realized I couldn't hear any of them anymore. Not gradually either. It was like somebody muted the entire woods. I noticed because I had my driver window cracked slightly, and suddenly all I could hear was my tires grinding over gravel. No bugs, no frogs, nothing. I turned the radio down thinking maybe I just hadn't noticed before, but even with the radio nearly off, the silence felt wrong immediately. I slowed down. The road curved around the old quarry pit up ahead. During the day, you could see rusted conveyors and piles of broken stone down there, but at night, it was usually just darkness. That was when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was construction equipment. The quarry technically belonged to some company out of Eugene, though nobody had worked it in years as far as I knew. But this light wasn't coming from the ground. It hung above the pit, low enough that I could see the dust under it moving around. That's the detail I keep thinking about. The dust. The light itself was pale white, almost colorless, but the air underneath looked thick and dirty, like powder floating in water. I stopped the truck without really meaning to. The engine idled while I stared through the windshield. The light didn't move much. It hovered maybe 30 or 40 feet above the quarry floor. No beam, no flashing, just steady. The silence outside got heavier the longer I watched. Even my truck sounded muffled somehow. I rolled down the window farther. The air smelled strange, like wet concrete and something metallic underneath it. I remember looking around for power lines or a helicopter or literally anything that made sense. Nothing. The fog near the quarry edge drifted slowly through the trees, but the air around the light itself looked perfectly still. Then I noticed shapes moving below it, not clearly. At first, I thought workers were down there walking around, but the movement didn't look right. Too slow. Too smooth, maybe. I couldn't tell if I was seeing actual people or shadows crossing through the dust. There were probably 4 or 5 of them, maybe. Every time I tried focusing on one directly, it blended into the haze again. I should have left right then. Instead, I pulled onto the shoulder and shut the truck off. The second the engine died, the silence became unbearable. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise. It honestly felt like being underwater. I sat there staring at the quarry for what I thought was maybe 5 minutes. At some point, I realized the light wasn't perfectly steady after all. It pulsed slightly, very faint. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough that the rocks around the pit brightened and dimmed every few seconds. That low humming started not long after. I felt it through the steering wheel first, not loud, just vibration. Like heavy machinery running somewhere underground. I got out of the truck. That part makes no sense to me now, because I am not the kind of person who investigates weird stuff alone at midnight. But at the time, it almost felt automatic. The gravel crunched insanely loud under my boots. I walked a little closer to the edge of the quarry and stopped near an old chain-link fence that had collapsed years earlier. The humming got stronger there. Not stronger in volume exactly, stronger physically. I could feel it in my chest. The light remained completely silent above the pit. I remember rubbing my arms because suddenly the air felt warm despite the cold night. Not normal warmth either. It felt dense somehow. I looked down into the quarry again and realized the dust beneath the light wasn't drifting naturally. It was moving upward, slowly, like the light was pulling it. That's when one of the shapes below looked directly up at me. At least I think it did. I couldn't make out features or even a face, but I got this immediate horrible feeling of being noticed. The humming stopped instantly. Everything became completely still. Then the light brightened. Not dramatically. Just enough that the quarry floor sharpened into view for half a second. I saw broken stone, old equipment, the shape standing below, and what looked like long shadows stretching across the gravel toward the fence where I stood. I stumbled backward immediately. The second I moved, the light dimmed again. I remember reaching for my phone, but realizing it was still in the truck. The silence pressed so hard against my ears it almost hurt. Then something else happened that bothered me more than the light itself. I heard footsteps behind me on the road. Slow, crunching gravel. I spun around expecting another car or maybe someone walking, but the road was empty. The sound stopped too. I stood there frozen for several seconds. Then the humming started again, louder this time. The dust under the light swirled harder. I got back in my truck after that. Fast. The engine struggled turning over for a second before finally starting. I kept looking in the mirrors while backing up because I had this overwhelming feeling something was close behind the truck even though I couldn't see anything. The light remained above the quarry, still hovering, still pale and steady. I drove away, probably too fast for that road. About 10 minutes later, the insects returned all at once. I remember that clearly because it startled me. 1 second silence, next second the woods exploded with noise again like somebody flipped a switch back on. I finally relaxed a little after that. By the time I reached town again, I'd mostly convinced myself there had to be some explanation. Construction equipment, illegal mining, some kind of industrial light reflecting through fog. I stopped at a red light near the grocery store and noticed the dashboard clock, 2:07 a.m. I stared at it for a long time. I should have been home before 12:30. Even if I'd stopped at the quarry longer than I realized, there was absolutely no way 2 hours had passed. I actually checked my phone immediately, thinking the truck clock was broken. Same time. My stomach dropped. The drive from the quarry to town only took maybe 15 minutes. I tried replaying everything in my head while driving home, but the timeline stopped making sense. I remembered getting out of the truck. Remembered standing near the fence. After that, things got blurry. Not erased exactly, just scattered. When I finally got home, my porch light had shut off automatically hours earlier. I walked inside, and my wife, Dana, was asleep on the couch waiting for me. The TV was still on mute. She woke up confused and asked where I'd been because she said she'd tried calling twice around 1-1. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no notifications at all from that period. I barely answered her. I went straight to the bathroom because something felt wrong, physically. My knees hurt. When I pulled my jeans up, both knees were packed with gray quarry gravel and dirt, like I'd been kneeling hard on the ground for a long time. Not just dust either. Small, sharp stones embedded into the fabric. My palms were scraped too. I remember standing there at the sink trying to understand how that could have happened because I had no memory of falling. The next morning I checked my truck. The driver's side door had fine gray dust all along the inside panel, same dust from the quarry floor. There were also handprints on the hood. Not clear enough to compare or anything like that, just streaks through the dirt. Long streaks, like somebody steadying themselves against the metal. We stayed at a caravan park on the north coast of Wales during the off-season a few years ago. It was late October, cold enough that most families had already stopped traveling, and the place was nearly empty when we arrived. The park sat on a cliffside above the sea, maybe 20 minutes outside Aberystwyth. Rows of white caravans stretched along gravel lanes with yellow security lights mounted on poles every few spaces. During summer, it was probably crowded and noisy, but that week there couldn't have been more than 4 occupied caravans total. It was me, my wife Hannah, and our son Elliot, who was 8 at the time. The weather had been miserable all day, rain blowing sideways off the water, low clouds, wind hard enough to shake the caravan walls occasionally. By evening, the storm mostly passed, but fog rolled in from the coast afterward, thick enough that you couldn't really see beyond the next row of caravans. I remember the silence most. Not complete silence, because you could still hear distant waves and the wind moving through the fencing near the cliffs, but the park itself felt abandoned. No people walking around, no TVs through windows, nothing. We spent most of the evening inside playing cards and watching movies while the heater clicked on and off. Around midnight, Hannah and Elliot went to sleep while I stayed up a little longer reading at the small kitchen table. That was when I first heard the humming. At first, I thought it was part of the heater, low and steady, but after a minute, I realized it kept changing slightly in pitch, almost pulsing. I muted the TV and listened harder. The sound definitely came from outside. Not loud enough to panic me or anything, just strange because the park didn't have much around it besides empty fields and the coastline. I looked out the kitchen window but couldn't see much beyond fog and weak yellow light from the lamp posts. The humming stopped after maybe 30 seconds, then started again farther away. That caught my attention because it sounded like movement. Not fast movement either, slow. Like whatever made the sound was drifting between the rows of caravans. I almost ignored it completely until Elliot spoke from the bedroom. "Dad?" His voice sounded sleepy and nervous. I walked back and found him sitting upright in bed staring toward the curtained window. He asked if someone was outside. I told him probably just maintenance or another guest. Then he asked why the lights outside kept dimming. That made me pause because I hadn't noticed anything like that earlier. I looked through the bedroom curtains carefully. At first, I only saw fog swirling around the security lights. Then I noticed a soft white glow moving slowly between the caravans across from ours, not bright enough to illuminate the ground properly. That's the detail I keep thinking about. The light should have cast shadows. The caravans had metal siding and sharp edges everywhere, but somehow the glow blurred across them without creating clear shapes. It moved steadily through the fog about chest height above the ground, not bobbing like a flashlight, just gliding. I remember trying to locate the person carrying it, but I couldn't see anyone, only the light itself. As it passed beneath one of the yellow security lamps, the lamp dimmed noticeably for a few seconds before brightening again once the glow moved on. The humming deepened slightly then. I could feel it faintly through the caravan floor. Elliot asked what it was. I told him honestly I didn't know. That was when Hannah woke up and immediately noticed us standing by the window. She looked outside too and went quiet for a second. The glow continued drifting through the rows, maybe 50 yards away now. Still no visible source. I remember opening the front caravan door slightly to listen better. The air outside felt oddly warm despite the cold night. Not warm everywhere exactly. More like patches of warm air drifting through the fog. The humming became clearer with the door open. It sounded mechanical at first, but not fully, almost layered with another deeper sound underneath it. No footsteps, no voices, nothing else moving. The white glow disappeared briefly behind another row of caravans, then reappeared closer. Hannah told me to shut the door immediately. I did. Something about the way the light moved bothered me more the longer I watched it. It never changed speed, never wavered, just floated between the caravans like it already knew where it was going. The security lights dimmed again one by one as it passed beneath them. I grabbed my phone and tried filming through the window. The video came out terrible, mostly fog and glare. At one point, the camera focused briefly and the light appeared larger on screen than it looked in real life. Not brighter, just wider somehow. Then the image distorted completely into static-looking grain before correcting itself. The humming got louder for maybe 10 seconds. Not loud enough to hurt, just enough that plates in the kitchen cupboards rattled slightly. Then everything stopped. The humming vanished instantly. The glow disappeared behind the caravans farther down the lane and never came back. Outside became quiet again, except for distant waves and wind. We stayed awake another hour after that. I checked outside twice before finally going to bed. Nothing looked unusual. No people walking around. No vehicles moving. The fog remained thick, though. At some point during the night, I woke briefly because I thought I heard movement outside near the gravel path. Not footsteps exactly, more like several caravan doors opening and closing far away. I almost got up to check, but fell back asleep. The next morning, the park looked strange immediately. The fog had mostly cleared, leaving everything wet and gray under low clouds. Hannah noticed it first while making coffee. One of the caravans across from ours had its door standing wide open. Then we noticed another farther down, and another. At least 5 caravan doors throughout the park stood partially or completely open despite the cold weather. No people outside, no staff vehicles, nothing. At first I assumed maybe the wind caught them overnight until I stepped outside. There hadn't been enough wind. The air felt dead still. I walked farther down the gravel lane, looking around while Elliot stayed inside with Hannah. Several doors remained hanging open inches wide. One caravan had its interior lights still on. Another had muddy footprints leading halfway down the steps before disappearing on the wet pavement. I knocked on one open caravan eventually because I thought maybe somebody needed help. An older man answered after a long pause, looking irritated and exhausted. Before I could even ask anything, he said, "Did your door open too?" I told him I didn't think so. He stared at me for a second and said he woke around 4 in the morning because his caravan door was standing open to the fog. He thought his wife had gotten up during the night and forgotten to latch it, except she thought he had done it. While we talked, another couple farther down emerged from their caravan, arguing quietly about the same thing. Both insisted they'd locked their door before bed. None of them mentioned the light. I didn't either. When I went back inside our caravan, Hannah asked if I'd checked our front door properly. I said yes. Then she pointed toward the handle. The deadbolt was unlocked. I knew for a fact I'd locked it before bed because I checked it twice after seeing the glow outside. The weirdest part came later while packing the car to leave. Elliot handed me one of his shoes and asked why there was sand inside it. Not beach sand. Dark gray grit. Fine and damp like wet ash. Both shoes had it packed deep into the soles, even though he hadn't worn them outside since the previous afternoon. When I shook them out onto the gravel, mixed in with the grit were tiny white shell fragments like the kind you find near the shoreline below the cliffs. Except we'd never gone down there. I lived in a townhouse complex outside of Akron for about 2 years. The houses were all connected in rows with tiny fenced backyards and narrow streets where everybody parked bumper to bumper. Quiet neighborhood mostly. Families, retirees, people walking dogs late at night. This happened in February during one of those wet winters where the snow never fully stuck. Everything stayed muddy for weeks. The roads were dirty, the grass was soaked, and the air constantly smelled like rain. That night had been unusually warm for winter. Heavy fog, too. I remember hearing water dripping outside my bedroom window from the gutters. I went to bed around midnight after watching TV downstairs. Nothing weird happened before that. No strange noises or lights. Just normal. The first thing I remember was waking up because the room felt too bright, not fully lit. More like when somebody outside shines headlights through thin curtains. At first I thought maybe someone had pulled into the driveway across the street. I checked my phone. 4:08 a.m. The brightness in the room had this strange pale color to it. Not yellow like headlights, more white-gray. I stayed still for a minute listening. No car engine, no voices outside, nothing. That immediately felt wrong because our neighborhood always had noise somewhere. Passing traffic, dogs barking, people leaving early for work, but everything outside sounded dead quiet. I sat up in bed and noticed the light shifting faintly across the ceiling. Not flickering exactly, more like moving water reflections. The curtains over my bedroom window were closed, but I could see this soft glow bleeding around the edges. I remember getting annoyed more than scared at first. I thought maybe a utility truck was outside with floodlights. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The carpet felt cold, but the air in the room felt oddly warm, almost stuffy. When I pulled the curtain aside, I honestly froze for a second because I couldn't understand what I was looking at. There was a circular glow hovering above the houses across the street. Not high in the sky, low, maybe just above rooftop level. It looked solid at first glance, but not completely defined around the edges, kind of blurred by the fog. No blinking lights, no sound. That's what hit me immediately. The silence. It just hung there motionless over the neighborhood. The fog around it looked brighter than everything else, almost illuminated from inside. I remember staring at it, trying to convince myself it was some kind of drone or helicopter light, except there was no beam pointing downward and absolutely no noise. I cracked the window slightly. The air outside felt strangely warm too. Not normal warm for February. Damp and heavy and completely still. Usually wind moved through the complex at night because the buildings created these little tunnels between rows of houses, but nothing moved. Not tree branches, not hanging flags, nothing. The glow remained fixed over the rooftops. After maybe 30 seconds, I noticed something else. None of the neighboring houses had lights on. Not one. I could see maybe 15 houses from my window, and every single one was dark. That somehow made the whole thing feel worse. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand to record it. The screen froze. Not dead battery, just frozen completely. I remember pressing the side button over and over while staring back out the window. The glow looked bigger now somehow, or closer. It was hard to tell because of the fog. Then I noticed movement near the houses below it. At first I thought someone else had finally come outside to look, but the shape moved strangely, too slowly. It crossed between two driveways without any visible detail, almost blending into the fog itself. I lost sight of it immediately. That was the first moment I actually felt afraid. I shut the window and stepped back from the curtain. The room seemed brighter than before now. Bright enough that I could see shadows from furniture against the walls even though my lamp was off. Then came this low humming sound. Very faint. I couldn't tell if it was outside or inside the house. Not mechanical exactly, more like vibration. I felt it in my chest before I fully heard it. I walked into the hallway upstairs because for some reason I suddenly wanted to check if my front door was locked. The hallway was dark except for that pale light leaking upward from the stairwell window downstairs. Everything in the house felt unusually still. No furnace running, no pipes creaking, nothing. Halfway down the hall, I noticed a smell. Wet dirt. Strong enough that I stopped walking. At first I thought maybe one of my cats had dragged mud inside somehow, except both cats were asleep in the guest room doorway staring downstairs, not moving. Their ears were pinned back flat. I remember whispering, "What's wrong with you?" because they looked terrified. Neither of them took their eyes off the stairs. That humming feeling got stronger then. The light downstairs brightened slightly. I could see it reflecting faintly off the framed pictures on the wall. I should have turned on lights or checked outside again or something normal, but instead I just stood there frozen with the cats staring toward the first floor. Then I heard a sound from downstairs. A soft thump, like somebody stepping onto carpet. I immediately thought someone had broken into the house. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept in the upstairs bathroom and stood at the top of the stairs listening. Nothing happened for maybe 20 seconds. Then another sound. Not footsteps exactly. More like slow movement against the wall downstairs. The cats bolted into the bedroom suddenly, which scared me enough that I almost dropped the flashlight. I yelled, "Hello?" toward the stairs. No answer. The humming stopped instantly. The silence afterward felt awful. Total silence. I finally forced myself to walk downstairs. Every light in the house was off except for the glow coming through the kitchen blinds. The front door was still locked. The back sliding door too. Nothing looked disturbed. I checked every room while trying not to look out the windows directly. When I finally did glance outside through the kitchen blinds, the glow was gone. The neighborhood looked normal again, dark and foggy. I checked the microwave clock, 5:41 a.m. That made no sense to me because it didn't feel like more than maybe 20 minutes had passed since waking up. I went back upstairs after that and locked my bedroom door even though I felt stupid doing it. I didn't sleep anymore. Around 7, the neighborhood slowly started waking up. Cars starting, people leaving for work. Normal sounds. Everything felt embarrassingly ordinary by daylight. I almost convinced myself I dreamed part of it until I stepped onto the upstairs landing. There were muddy footprints in the carpet. Not wet anymore. Dried slightly brown against the beige fabric. I stopped immediately trying to process what I was seeing. The prints started near the staircase. Bare feet. Human looking. Not huge, not distorted, just wrong somehow. The spacing looked odd. Too narrow, maybe. They went down the hallway directly toward my bedroom. One after another. Clear enough that you could see partial toe marks. but there were no prints leading away, only toward my room. I checked the entire upstairs twice, nothing going back toward the stairs. Nothing inside the bedroom itself either, just footprints ending a few feet from my door. I actually called maintenance first because my brain refused to process it any other way. I thought maybe somebody from another unit had entered somehow by mistake. The maintenance guy, Arturo, came over around 9. He stared at the prints for a long time without saying much. Then he asked if I'd walked outside barefoot earlier. I told him no. He crouched down near the last footprint by my bedroom and touched the carpet, still slightly damp underneath. He checked all the doors and windows downstairs, nothing forced open. Then he asked if I had kids in the house. I said no. He didn't really know what to say after that. Before leaving, he mentioned something strange, almost casually. He said several people in the complex had complained about their dogs acting weird overnight around 4 in the morning, barking at windows, refusing to go outside. One woman farther down the street apparently thought someone had been shining lights into her house through the fog. That afternoon, I tried cleaning the footprints myself. The marks faded, but never disappeared completely. For months afterward, if the light hit the carpet a certain way, you could still faintly see them leading down the hallway toward my room. Only toward it. I worked maintenance for a communications company in western Nebraska for about 3 years. Most of the job was routine stuff, replacing batteries, checking sensors, climbing towers, fixing weather equipment after storms. A lot of the sites were isolated too, miles from towns or highways. You'd spend entire days alone out on dirt roads with nobody around. This happened in late November near Scottsbluff. There was a weather tower about 40 miles north of town that kept dropping offline during windstorms. My supervisor, Dennis, sent me out to inspect the wiring because the system kept reporting voltage problems. I left just after sunrise. The weather sucked that day. Not snowing exactly, but cold rain mixed with sleet. Gray sky, heavy clouds sitting low over the plains. The dirt roads were half mud by the time I reached the access gate. The tower sat on a ridge by itself, surrounded by open grassland. No houses, no trees, just fencing around the equipment shack and the tower rising maybe 200 feet into the air. I remember noticing how quiet it was when I parked. Usually out there, the wind never stopped. You'd hear it humming through the tower cables constantly. That morning, everything felt strangely dead. No birds, no wind against the truck, just distant thunder somewhere beyond the hills. I grabbed my tool bag and radio and headed through the gate. The tower itself looked normal at first. Red warning lights blinking at the top, guy wires wet from the rain. I unlocked the equipment shed and checked the power system inside for maybe 15 minutes. Nothing obvious looked wrong. The batteries tested fine. Wiring looked intact. Dennis radioed me around, then asking for an update. His voice kept cutting out under static. I told him I was going to climb halfway up and inspect the relay housing directly. He sounded annoyed already because the weather was getting worse. The static on the radio sounded strange, though, not normal interference. It came in deep pulses, almost rhythmic. I actually held the radio away from my ear because the sound hurt to listen to after a while. Outside, the rain had mostly stopped. The sky looked brighter somehow despite the clouds. I clipped into the tower ladder and started climbing. About 80 feet up, I noticed the temperature changing. The air felt warmer near the tower itself. Not dramatically, just enough that I stopped and looked around because it didn't make sense in freezing rain. Everything below me looked washed gray except for the tower supports, reflecting this faint white light. At first, I thought sunlight was finally breaking through clouds. Then I realized the light wasn't coming from above. It was beside the tower, close enough that I could see it reflecting off the wet metal beams. I froze immediately. There was a bright object hanging motionless maybe 30 feet away from the tower. No blinking lights, no visible structure really, just brightness. That sounds vague, but I honestly couldn't make out a solid shape around it. The edges blurred against the clouds like staring at a spotlight through fog. It hovered perfectly still beside the tower, no sound, no movement. I remember gripping the ladder so hard my hands cramped because my brain kept trying to turn it into something normal. Helicopter, drone, crane light. but there was nothing supporting it, and it was too close. If it had moved suddenly, I probably would have climbed down immediately, but the fact it stayed completely motionless somehow made it worse. The radio exploded with static then, not regular crackling. This sounded heavy, deep, almost like machinery grinding underwater. Dennis's voice tried coming through but got swallowed completely. Then I heard another sound underneath the static. A pulse, low and slow. Whum! A few seconds later again. Whum! I felt it through the metal tower more than heard it. The whole structure vibrated faintly against my boots. The bright object remained beside me. I remember realizing the rain had stopped entirely. Not just near the tower, everywhere. The clouds above looked frozen in place. Even the guy wires hanging from the tower had stopped moving. That was the moment I got genuinely scared because everything suddenly felt wrong in a way I can't explain properly. It was like the entire area had gone still around that thing. The pulsing continued. Whum, whum, each one stronger than the last. The radio static rose and fell with it. I looked down toward my truck and noticed something strange there too. The puddles around the tires were vibrating, tiny ripples moving across the water every time the pulse happened. I started climbing down immediately. Halfway down the ladder, I noticed the metal supports around me were warm to the touch despite the cold weather. Not hot, just warm enough to feel unnatural. The light beside the tower stayed level with me while I descended. That part bothered me afterward. I never actually saw it move, but somehow it remained at the same height beside me the entire time, like it was matching my position without motion. I avoided looking directly at it after that because every time I focused on it too long, my eyes watered badly. About 30 feet from the ground, the radio suddenly cleared for half a second. Dennis was shouting my name, then static swallowed him again. The pulsing sound became louder than ever. Whum! Whum! I felt it in my chest now. The tower vibrated hard enough that loose sleet shook from the beams around me. Then something moved below. I saw shapes crossing near the fence line around the tower compound. At least I think I did. Dark figures moving through the mist near the ground. Too large to be dogs. Too slow to be people running. I stopped climbing again, trying to focus on them, but every time I looked directly toward the movement, it blended into the gray rain haze. The bright object pulsed once suddenly, not the same as before. This felt more like a flash without actually getting brighter. Every wet surface around the tower reflected white for a split second. Then the radio screamed with feedback so loud I nearly dropped it. I lost my footing right after that. Not a full fall because my harness caught me immediately, but my knees slammed hard against the ladder and I remember hanging there for a second trying to breathe. The pulsing stopped completely. So did the static. Everything went silent. I looked back toward the object. Gone. Not moving away, not fading, just gone. The sky looked normal again. Wind returned instantly, rattling the tower cables overhead hard enough to make me flinch. Rain started falling again too. I climbed down the rest of the way as fast as I could. My boots hit the ground and I immediately checked the time on my phone, 1:42 p.m. I stared at it because it made no sense. I'd arrived at the tower a little after noon. There was absolutely no way I'd been on that ladder for over an hour. It felt like maybe 15 minutes total. The radio crackled normally then. Dennis came through furious. "Where the hell have you been?" I just stood there in the mud holding the radio. He kept talking before I could answer. Said he'd been trying to reach me for the last 40 minutes. Said my GPS tracker showed me stationary at the tower the whole time. He thought I'd fallen or gotten hurt because I stopped responding completely. I looked back up at the tower while he yelled. The metal supports were still wet from rain, but now I noticed streaks along one side. Long, clean marks through the grime and rust. Parallel lines, like something had pressed against the tower itself. I didn't tell Dennis about the light. I said the radio failed during the climb and I slipped coming down. He told me to finish the inspection and get back before the roads got worse. I tried. I really did. But once I entered the equipment shed again, I noticed the inside smelled strange, like overheated electronics mixed with wet soil. Several tools from my bag had been moved too. Not stolen, just rearranged carefully across the floor. The screwdriver set I kept clipped together was lined up side by side near the doorway. My voltage tester sat upright on the workbench. I knew I hadn't left them like that because I'm obsessive about keeping my tools packed. The deepest weirdness hit me later that night at home. I was cleaning mud off my boots in the garage when I noticed gray residue packed into the seams around my knees and gloves. Not dirt, fine powder, almost like ash. Same color as the dust coating the tower supports. When I shook my jacket out, small metal shavings fell onto the concrete floor. Tiny curled fragments like filings from drilling steel. I checked the tower maintenance report the next morning before submitting it. According to the system logs, the weather station recorded 0 wind activity between 12:58 and 1:39 p.m. That tower always recorded wind, especially during storms. But for 41 minutes, every sensor on the site flatlined completely except for one, the temperature monitor. It showed the air around the tower rising steadily from 38 degrees to almost 71 before dropping back down again all at once. I worked overnight security at a plastics factory outside Dayton for about 8 months. The place ran daytime shifts only by then, so nights were mostly dead. My job was just locking gates, checking loading docks, and watching camera feeds from a little security office near the front entrance. The factory itself was huge. Long, flat rooftops, warehouse sections, metal ventilation systems everywhere. At night, the whole property looked empty and gray under floodlights. Most shifts were boring enough that I'd spend hours drinking coffee and walking laps through the buildings just to stay awake. This happened in March during a stretch of heavy rain. Not thunderstorms, just constant cold rain and low clouds for days straight. That night, visibility was terrible. The parking lot reflected all the floodlights and fog drifted low around the fences near the back loading area. I clocked in around 10 p.m. Everything was normal until maybe 1 in the morning. I was sitting in the security office watching camera feeds when camera 12 flickered briefly. Camera 12 overlooked the rear warehouse roof and employee parking lot. At first, I thought it was rain interference because the cameras glitched constantly during bad weather. But the flicker happened again. Then the image distorted sideways for maybe half a second like static dragging across the screen. I leaned closer because something bright appeared at the top edge of the feed. At first, I assumed it was reflection from the floodlights. Then I realized the glow was above the roof. Oval-shaped, bright white, hovering low over the factory building, not high in the sky, maybe 20 or 30 feet above the roofline. I stared at the monitor, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The glow didn't blink, didn't move. It just hung there in the rain. I switched to another camera angle covering the same section of roof. Same thing. A bright oval glow suspended above the building. No visible structure around it. The rain made the edges blurry, but the light itself looked solid somehow. I remember grabbing the radio to call maintenance, even though nobody else was on site that night. The second I keyed the mic, the radio filled with static so loud I jerked it away from my ear. Not normal crackling either. Deep pulsing interference, almost rhythmic. I tried again. Same thing. Then every camera monitor in the office went black at once. Not powered off, still on, but no image. Just black screens with faint rolling distortion. I sat there listening to rain hit the office windows while the static continued through the radio. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then the feeds came back. Every camera now showed heavy visual distortion crawling across the images. Horizontal lines, warping, random white flickers. Except camera 12. That one looked mostly clear. And it showed me standing outside in the parking lot. I remember freezing because I was obviously still sitting inside the security office. For a second, my brain genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. Then I realized the footage wasn't live. The timestamp in the corner lagged behind by about 20 minutes. I watched myself standing alone near the center of the parking lot facing the warehouse roof, completely motionless, rain pouring around me. The glow hovered above the building directly ahead. I looked at the current time on the security office clock. 1:26 a.m. The footage timestamp showed 1:07. I kept staring at the screen while trying to understand whether the system was replaying old footage automatically or something. But then the timestamp advanced normally. 1:08, 1:09. I was still standing there in the rain, not moving at all. My stomach dropped because I had absolutely no memory of being outside. I checked the office immediately. My jacket was hanging on the chair, my flashlight sat on the desk, but my boots were wet. Fresh mud tracked across the floor near the office door too. I remember standing there feeling genuinely dizzy. The footage kept playing on camera 12. Me standing perfectly still in the parking lot, head tilted slightly upward toward the glow, rain moving sideways across the screen from the wind. No movement from me whatsoever. I watched almost 4 full minutes before the version of me on screen finally shifted slightly, not walking, just turning slowly in place, like following something overhead. The oval glow above the roof remained fixed. The camera distortion worsened whenever it appeared fully in frame. I rewound the footage thinking maybe I'd somehow gone outside without realizing earlier. The system replayed it from 1:03 a.m. The camera feed showed the parking lot empty at first. Then the distortion intensified suddenly. Horizontal white bands rolled through the image, and the glow appeared above the warehouse roof almost instantly. No movement into frame, just there. A few seconds later, I walked into view from the security office side door, slowly, arms hanging at my sides. I stopped in the middle of the parking lot and stood there staring upward. That was it. No reaction, no pacing, nothing, just standing perfectly still. I watched myself remain there until 1:22 a.m., 19 straight minutes. The weirdest part was my posture. I didn't look normal, not injured or unconscious, just unnaturally still. Even people standing around usually shift weight or move their arms eventually. I barely moved at all. Then at 1:23, the image distorted heavily again. The glow brightened enough to wash out part of the screen, and suddenly I was gone from the frame. Not walking away, not running, just absent once the distortion cleared. The parking lot stood empty again. A few seconds later, the camera returned to live feed. I was back inside the office staring at the monitors. I remember checking myself physically after that. My hands shook badly. My shoulders and neck felt stiff, like I'd been standing outside in the cold much longer than 20 minutes. There was gravel embedded in one knee of my work pants too. I kept replaying the footage over and over, trying to find missing frames or editing glitches. Nothing obvious. The timestamp stayed continuous. The rain stayed consistent. I finally forced myself to go outside because I needed to see the roof directly. Part of me expected the glow to still be there. The parking lot looked normal when I stepped out. Rain, floodlights, empty cars, no glow above the building anymore, but something felt wrong immediately. The air was unusually warm. Not everywhere on the property, just near the back warehouse. Warm enough that steam rose faintly from puddles despite the cold rain. I walked toward the area where I'd stood in the footage. My boots splashed through shallow water while the floodlights buzzed overhead. Halfway across the lot, I noticed the sound, a low hum, barely audible beneath the rain. Not machinery, more like vibration carried through the ground. I stopped walking instantly because it felt familiar somehow. The same pulsing rhythm from the radio static earlier. I looked up toward the roofline again. Nothing there, but several puddles near me trembled faintly in circles every few seconds. The humming deepened briefly, then stopped. Complete silence afterward, except rainfall. I went back inside immediately after that and locked the office door, which I'd honestly never done before, during a shift. The cameras remained distorted for the rest of the night. Not enough to stop working completely, but enough that every bright surface smeared across the screens strangely. Around 4 a.m., my supervisor, Leon, arrived early because one of the warehouse alarms had triggered briefly during the outage. I showed him the footage without saying much. He watched quietly for a long time, then asked why I'd been standing outside in the rain for 20 minutes. I told him I didn't remember going out there. He thought I was joking at first. Then he asked why I looked drugged in the video. That word stuck with me because honestly, he wasn't wrong. The version of me in the footage didn't look alert, just fixed in place. Leon tried blaming exhaustion or sleepwalking or stress, but he kept replaying the section where the glow appeared above the roof. At one point, he paused the footage and zoomed in. The distortion around the object became worse immediately. The screen warped so heavily that the software froze twice trying to render it. You still couldn't make out detail though, just brightness shaped vaguely like an oval. Before leaving that morning, I checked the parking lot one last time in daylight. Near the spot where I'd stood in the footage, the wet asphalt had dried in a rough circular patch, maybe 15 feet wide, despite the rain continuing overnight. Not burned, just dry. There were also faint marks across the surface inside the circle, thin parallel streaks, like something heavy had dragged lightly over the pavement without fully touching it. I quit about 2 weeks later, not because I thought the factory was haunted or anything dramatic like that. I just couldn't stop thinking about the footage, especially the part where I stood completely motionless looking upward while the rain hammered down around me. 19 minutes without moving once. I used to walk around the Mercer Reservoir Trail outside Fort Collins a few evenings a week. It wasn't really for exercise. I just liked being near the water after work because the place stayed quiet once the fishermen left. There was a paved walking path that looped around part of the shoreline with scattered streetlights and benches every few hundred feet. This happened in early September. The weather had been weird all week. Hot during the day, but windy and cold after sunset. That evening, the sky stayed overcast, and by the time I got there, around 7:30 p.m., everything already looked dim, like a storm was coming. I almost didn't go because the parking lot was nearly empty. Only one truck near the boat launch, and another car farther down by the picnic area. I remember noticing how calm the reservoir looked when I started walking. Usually the wind pushed small waves against the rocks, but the water looked strangely flat, despite the trees moving around the shoreline. The trail followed the edge of the reservoir for a while before curving uphill through brush and old utility poles. The streetlights along that stretch were old sodium lights that buzzed constantly after dark. I had headphones in at first, but no music playing, just wearing them out of habit. About 20 minutes into the walk, I noticed somebody standing near the water ahead. At least I thought it was a person. There was a faint white light near the shoreline, maybe 200 feet away. Not bright enough to illuminate anything around it, just a pale glow hovering low over the water. I assumed somebody was night fishing with a lantern. But as I got closer, I realized I couldn't actually see a person holding it. The light moved slowly along the edge of the reservoir, smoothly. No bobbing motion like someone walking. It stayed maybe a foot above the waterline the entire time. That caught my attention immediately because there were no ripples under it. The surface stayed perfectly still. I stopped walking for a second, trying to understand what I was looking at. The light drifted beneath one of the streetlights near the shore. The streetlight dimmed instantly, not flickered. Dimmed, like somebody lowering a brightness switch. As soon as the white glow passed beyond it, the streetlight returned to normal. I stood there staring at it long enough that I became aware of how quiet everything had gotten. No birds, no insects. Even the traffic from the highway farther east sounded distant, suddenly. The light kept moving along the shoreline at the same slow speed. Still no ripples, still no visible source. I took one earbud out and listened carefully. There was a sound coming from somewhere near the water. Not mechanical exactly, more like low vibration, almost too deep to hear clearly. I remember looking around expecting someone else on the trail to notice it too, but the path behind me was empty. The truck near the boat launch was gone now too. The light stopped moving suddenly. It hovered beside a cluster of rocks near the shoreline. Then it drifted sideways across the water, not turning or changing direction naturally, just sliding. That's the moment I pulled my phone out. I zoomed in with the camera, but the image looked terrible immediately. Grainy and dark, even though the light itself was visible with my eyes. I started recording video anyway. The second I hit record, the streetlight nearest me dimmed too. I looked up instinctively. The bulb buzzed loudly overhead for maybe 2 seconds before fading almost completely. The trail around me darkened enough that I could barely see the pavement. The white glow on the water remained perfectly visible though. Something about that scared me enough that I almost turned around right there. But curiosity kept winning over common sense every few seconds. I kept filming while walking slowly closer to the shoreline. The air felt colder near the water. Not normal nighttime cold either. Damp and heavy. I remember rubbing my arms because goosebumps started forming even through my hoodie. The low vibrating sound got stronger. I could feel it faintly in my teeth. The glow drifted farther from shore again, still no ripples beneath it. At one point it passed directly under another street light farther ahead, and the exact same thing happened. The light overhead dimmed slowly until the object moved past. I actually whispered, "What the hell," out loud because it was too consistent to ignore. That was when I noticed another strange detail. The reflection on the water didn't match. There should have been a long vertical reflection beneath the glow, but instead there was only this blurry patch directly under it. Like the light wasn't fully touching the surface somehow. I stopped walking completely after that. The object remained maybe 50 yards away now. The vibrating sound pulsed once, stronger than before. My phone screen went black immediately, not powered off, just black. The recording timer still moved faintly in the corner. Then everything around me seemed to go unnaturally still again. The trees stopped moving despite the wind. The water flattened completely. Even the buzzing from the streetlights disappeared. I remember becoming intensely aware of my own breathing because it sounded too loud. The glow began moving toward my side of the reservoir, slowly, not fast or aggressive. That somehow made it worse. It approached in complete silence except for that deep vibration. I backed away from the shoreline instinctively. The phone screen remained black in my hand. The timer kept counting upward. The glow stopped maybe 30 feet from shore, close enough now that I could see mist forming around it above the water. Not fog from the reservoir, something tighter around the light itself. I tried focusing on its shape, but couldn't. Every time I looked directly at it, my eyes watered badly and the edges blurred. I remember becoming aware of another sound behind me then. Footsteps on the trail, slow, crunching gravel. I turned around immediately, expecting another person. Nobody there. The trail stretched empty beneath the dim streetlights. When I looked back toward the water, the glow had moved closer again without me seeing it happen. The vibrating pulse hit harder this time. My chest tightened painfully for a second. Then my phone slipped from my hand. Not dropped exactly. My fingers just sort of stopped gripping properly. The phone landed screen up on the pavement, still recording black video. I bent down to grab it and noticed the streetlights ahead beginning to dim one by one farther down the trail. Not all at once, sequentially, like something moving beneath them. That was enough for me. I picked up the phone and started walking fast back toward the parking lot. Not running yet, just trying not to panic. The vibrating sound followed. Every few seconds, another streetlight behind me dimmed briefly. I refused to look back after a while because I had this horrible feeling I'd see something much closer than before. About halfway to the parking lot, I realized the entire trail looked darker than it should have. I checked my phone again. The screen still showed black video recording, no image whatsoever, but the audio meter moved slightly. I stopped the recording finally. The second I did, normal sound rushed back all at once. Wind through trees, water against rocks, distant highway traffic, a dog barking somewhere far off. I actually staggered a little because the sudden noise felt overwhelming. The streetlights behind me brightened back to normal too. I turned around finally. The reservoir looked empty. No glow anywhere, just dark water and moving trees. I got back to my car shaking hard enough that I had trouble unlocking it. The dashboard clock said 9:46 p.m. That confused me immediately because I'd started the walk shortly after 7:30, and the loop I usually took only lasted about 40 minutes. I sat there trying to reconstruct the timeline, but couldn't. The strangest part came later at home. I checked the video recording, expecting maybe corrupted footage or accidental camera failure. The file was there, 1 hour and 3 minutes long, completely black. No image at all, not darkness from the camera being covered either. Total flat blackness without movement, but the audio worked. At first, it only captured my footsteps and breathing near the reservoir. Then around the 20-minute mark, the environmental sounds faded away completely. No wind, no water, nothing. Just that low pulsing vibration. It repeated slowly through most of the recording, every few seconds. Deep enough that my phone speakers distorted trying to play it. Around 40 minutes in, I heard something else underneath it. Movement. Not voices exactly, more like several set footsteps walking through shallow water, slow and uneven. At one point, I heard myself breathing hard, very close to the microphone, like I was holding the phone near my face. But I had absolutely no memory of that part. Near the end of the recording, the pulsing stopped abruptly. Then there was about 30 seconds where my phone microphone picked up nothing at all. Not silence. Actual nothing. Like the audio had been stripped out completely. After that, normal night sounds returned instantly, and the recording ended with me unlocking my car. It happened in northern Minnesota during January, a few winters ago. Me and my friend Darren had been staying at his uncle's cabin near Lake Vermilion for a long weekend. The place sat way back in the woods with no nearby houses except one abandoned fishing shack across the lake. The lake froze solid every winter, and locals crossed parts of it constantly on snowmobiles and ATVs once the ice got thick enough. That night, we'd gone into town for drinks and food. Nothing crazy. Couple beers each. By the time we headed back, it was around 11 p.m., and snow had started falling lightly again. Darren suggested crossing the lake instead of driving the long road around because it would cut 20 minutes off the trip back to the cabin. People did it all the time. His truck stayed parked near the public launch on the opposite side, so we started walking across with flashlights and heavy coats while snow drifted over the ice around us. The cold felt brutal at first, one of those nights where breathing through your nose hurt. But the wind had mostly died down, which made the lake strangely quiet. No cars, no animals, nothing except distant ice cracking once in a while somewhere far off. We followed old snowmobile tracks stretching across the lake toward the cabin side. At first, everything felt normal. The snow squeaked under our boots, and our flashlight beams bounced off blowing flakes. You could barely see the shoreline behind us after maybe 10 minutes out there. The cloud cover reflected enough moonlight that the lake glowed dim gray in every direction. About halfway across, Darren stopped walking suddenly. I almost bumped into him. He pointed down at the ice. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed a faint light beneath the surface. Not bright, just pale and blurry under the ice several feet below us. I remember immediately assuming it was someone ice fishing with lights underwater, except there were no tents anywhere nearby. No holes cut in the ice. Nothing. The glow moved slowly beneath us, keeping pace with our walking. That's the part that turned the whole thing strange right away. Every time we moved forward, it drifted forward too, not darting around like a fish or flashlight beam, just gliding under the ice beside us. Darren laughed nervously and said something about weird lake reflection, but I could tell from his voice he didn't believe it either. We crouched down to look closer. The ice was thick but unusually clear beneath the snow patches. You could see dark water farther below and long trapped cracks stretching across it. The glow stayed maybe 10 feet under the surface, roundish, soft white, no visible source, and no movement in the water around it. That bothered me most because if something moved under ice that deep, you'd normally expect current or distortion or at least shifting shadows. This thing stayed perfectly smooth. We started walking again faster this time. The glow matched us immediately. I remember getting this horrible awareness that it wasn't just beneath the lake randomly. It was following our exact position. The snow around us suddenly seemed quieter too. No wind anymore. Even our footsteps sounded muffled. Then the ice vibrated lightly under my boots, not cracking, more like distant machinery humming somewhere below. I stopped instantly. Darren felt it too because he looked at me right away without saying anything. The vibration pulsed again, soft, steady, almost too faint to notice at first. You could feel it through the soles of your boots more than hear it. The light below us brightened slightly during each pulse. Not dramatically, just enough that the cracks inside the ice became more visible. I remember backing away instinctively while staring downward. The glow shifted with me. Exactly. That was the first moment real panic started setting in. We both picked up our pace after that. Not running because running on ice at night is stupid, but walking fast enough that our breathing got heavy. The shoreline ahead still looked far away through the snow. The light beneath us continued pacing every step. The vibration deepened gradually. At one point, I stopped and stamped my boot hard against the ice, trying to convince myself the sensation came from movement or echoes or something natural. The second my boot hit the surface, the glow stopped moving, completely still beneath me. The vibration stopped too. Everything went silent. No wind, no snowfall against our jackets. Nothing. Then the light moved upward slightly. Not fast, maybe only a foot or two closer to the ice, but enough that I stumbled backward immediately. The glow beneath the surface sharpened for half a second, and I remember thinking it looked larger than before. Not small like a flashlight anymore, wide, diffuse around the edges. Darren grabbed my arm and told me we needed to keep moving. His voice sounded wrong somehow out there, flat and swallowed by the snow. We started walking again quickly. The light resumed pacing beneath us instantly. That's when the machinery feeling got stronger. The ice itself seemed to hum faintly underfoot now. Hum! A few seconds later again. Hum! Not loud enough to echo across the lake, just deep enough that it traveled through the ice into your legs. I made the mistake of looking behind us. The shoreline we'd left looked farther away than it should have. Much farther. I remember actually stopping and turning fully around, trying to orient myself because suddenly I couldn't judge distance properly anymore. The snowmobile tracks behind us faded into darkness after only a short stretch. The falling snow seemed thicker too, despite the storm being light earlier. Darren snapped at me to keep walking. His flashlight shook badly now. Mine did too, honestly. Then something else happened. The light beneath the ice drifted ahead of us for the first time, maybe 15 feet forward. It stopped there waiting. I know how stupid that sounds, but that's exactly what it felt like. Waiting. The vibration under the ice became almost constant then. Not violent, just steady, low humming through the frozen lake. The weirdest part was the ice itself never cracked once. No stress noises, no shifting, just vibration. We kept moving because standing still out there suddenly felt impossible. The glow stayed ahead of us now, gliding beneath the surface in the direction we were walking. At one point, Darren whispered, "Do you hear that?" I listened hard. Under the humming, there was another sound. Metallic, maybe. Very distant, like heavy equipment operating miles underground. It rose and faded irregularly beneath the ice. Then all at once, the glow vanished completely. No fading, no movement away, just gone. The vibration stopped too. Wind hit us immediately afterward, hard enough to blow snow across the lake again. Normal sound returned with it, our boots crunching, jackets rustling. Darren actually laughed out loud from nerves and said something about methane pockets or electrical currents or whatever explanation his brain could grab first. Neither of us really believed it though. We kept walking without stopping again. A few minutes later, we finally reached the shoreline near the cabin trail. The second my boots hit solid ground, I realized how tense my whole body had become. My legs actually hurt. Darren leaned against a tree, breathing hard while brushing snow off his coat. That's when he looked down at his wristwatch. He frowned immediately. What the hell? The watch had stopped completely. 11:47 p.m. Frozen second hand. He smacked it against his palm a couple times. Nothing. Then I checked my phone. 12:19 a.m. We both just stared at each other, because there was no way the crossing had taken nearly an hour. Even walking cautiously in snow, it should have been maybe 20 minutes max. Darren kept insisting his watch had been working earlier in town because he checked it before we left the bar. Back at the cabin, things got stranger. The front porch light was off, even though Darren swore he'd left it on before we went into town. Inside, the cabin felt unusually warm. Not cozy warm. Heavy. Almost humid. The wood stove had burned low hours earlier, but somehow the air felt overheated. I remember pulling my gloves off and noticing my fingertips tingling badly. Darren finally got the watch running again after winding it manually, but the time never corrected properly afterward. It kept losing exactly 30 minutes every day, no matter what he did. The next morning, we walked back to the lake edge in daylight. Fresh snow had covered most of our tracks, except for a few stretches near shore. But out on the lake, maybe 100 yards from where we first noticed the glow, there was a strange patch beneath the ice. A pale cloudy circle under the frozen surface maybe 20 feet wide. No snow on top of it, just bare, clear ice surrounded by white. I worked EMS outside Sioux Falls for several years, mostly covering rural calls across a few counties where farms sat miles apart and backup could take forever to arrive. A lot of nights were uneventful, but the isolation got to you after a while. Long stretches of empty roads, radio chatter fading in and out, no streetlights for miles. This happened in late April during storm season. The weather had been unstable all evening. Warm rain earlier, then thick, low clouds moving across the fields with occasional lightning far off on the horizon. Not an active storm overhead, just constant, distant flashes beyond the farms. Partner that night was a guy named Curtis. Around 1:20 in the morning, dispatch sent us to a medical call on an isolated farm road west of town. Elderly male with chest pain. Caller said he was dizzy and struggling to breathe. The address sat nearly 30 minutes out from the nearest highway. I remember because the GPS kept cutting through gravel roads I'd never driven before. By the time we reached the property, the rain had stopped completely. Fog drifted low across the fields, and the farm itself looked almost abandoned, except for one porch light glowing weakly near the house. No other vehicles, no neighboring homes visible anywhere. The patient was a man named Walter Green, probably mid-70s. We found him sitting at the kitchen table, pale and sweating heavily while his wife stood nearby, panicking. Classic cardiac symptoms at first glance. We got him loaded into the ambulance pretty quickly because the nearest hospital was a long drive. Walter stayed alert during transport initially, nervous but responsive, complaining about pressure in his chest and tingling in his arms. Curtis drove while I stayed in the back monitoring vitals. The road leaving the farm cut through open fields for miles without much tree cover. You could see lightning flickering behind clouds way off in the distance through the rear windows. About 10 minutes into transport, I noticed Walter staring past me toward the back ambulance doors. At first, I assumed he was disoriented. I asked if he was okay. No response, not unconscious, just staring. I turned around expecting maybe headlights behind us. Instead, I saw a bright light hovering low over a field beside the road. Not directly behind the ambulance. Off to the right, maybe a few hundred yards away. It sat low over the ground above the crops. Bright white, perfectly steady. At first, I thought it was farm equipment. But there were no vehicles, no movement, and no visible beams shining downward. The light just hung there above the field. I remember watching it for maybe 5 seconds, trying to understand the scale of it. Then I realized something else. The ambulance cabin had become unusually quiet. Normally, you constantly hear road noise, diesel engine vibration, radio chatter from the front. But suddenly, all of that sounded distant and muffled. Walter kept staring toward the light without blinking much. His breathing slowed too. Not medically worse. Calmer. Way calmer than before. I asked him again if he could hear me. Nothing. His pulse, which had been racing earlier, started dropping steadily toward normal. That honestly worried me more because the change happened too fast. I knocked on the divider window toward Curtis. No answer. Usually he responded immediately. I opened the little sliding panel. Curtis? He didn't look back. The road ahead beyond the windshield looked strangely pale, like fog reflecting moonlight, even though the sky stayed fully overcast. Then the radio emitted a burst of static loud enough to make me flinch. Not normal interference. Deep pulsing distortion. Walter finally spoke then, very quietly. There it is again. I turned toward him immediately. Again? Before I could ask anything else, he slowly raised one hand toward the rear doors, still staring at the light outside. His face looked completely calm now, almost peaceful. The bright object remained beside the field, pacing the ambulance somehow, not racing ahead or falling behind, keeping exact distance with us. That's when I noticed it wasn't illuminating the ground properly. The crops beneath it should have been lit clearly, but instead the field looked washed out and flat around the glow. No shadows. The radio static deepened into this low rhythmic hum. Whum. Several seconds later again. Whum. I felt it through the ambulance floor more than heard it. The heart monitor flickered once, then stabilized. Walter smiled slightly while staring toward the field. Not at me, at the light. I remember becoming intensely uncomfortable because nothing about the situation felt medically normal anymore. I reached for the radio mic in the back to contact dispatch. The second I keyed it, the speaker exploded into static. No voice traffic whatsoever. Then everything outside seemed to dim slightly. Not darkness exactly. More like contrast draining from the world. The ambulance interior lights looked pale gray instead of white. Walter's skin tone even seemed washed out. The humming continued. Whum! Whum! I checked the clock mounted above the cabinets. 1:42 a.m. Then I looked back toward the field again. The light had moved closer, not dramatically close, but near enough now that I could tell it wasn't sitting on the ground at all. It hovered maybe 15 or 20 feet above the crops. Oval-shaped, soft around the edges, no visible structure, and completely silent despite the humming vibrating through the ambulance. Walter spoke again without taking his eyes off it. They came to the barn first. I asked him what he meant. No answer, just staring. Then he said quietly, "Don't stop." That part hit me hard because I hadn't realized Curtis had slowed down. I looked through the divider again. The ambulance crawled along the road, now barely moving. Curtis sat rigid behind the wheel, staring forward. Not unconscious, just fixed in place. I shouted his name louder, no response. The humming became stronger suddenly. Every loose metal instrument in the cabinets rattled faintly. Outside, the field light drifted closer to the roadside fence line. Still pacing us, still no shadows beneath it. Then all sound disappeared. Instantly. No engine, no tires on gravel, no radio static. Nothing. Complete silence. Walter continued staring out the rear windows, smiling faintly. I remember hearing only my own breathing inside my head because literally everything else had stopped. The ambulance itself felt motionless. I looked out the side window. The field no longer seemed to move past us. The light hovered directly beside the road, now maybe 50 yards away. Close enough that I could see mist swirling around it low over the crops. I tried speaking again, but my own voice sounded muted and distant. Walter slowly sat upright on the stretcher despite being strapped in, not struggling, just rising slightly while staring outward. The silence lasted long enough that I started feeling disoriented, like my ears needed to pop. Then I noticed another shape near the field, darker than the surrounding crops. Tall, standing motionless beneath the glow. At least I think it was standing. Every time I tried focusing directly on it, the outline blurred strangely. Walter whispered something I couldn't fully hear. I only caught the words "same place." Then the light pulsed once. Not brighter, denser somehow. And normal sounds slammed back all at once. The ambulance engine roared, tires rattled against gravel, the radio crackled violently. I stumbled sideways hard enough to grab the counter for balance. Curtis finally yelled through the divider, asking why I kept hitting the partition. I stared at him, completely confused. The ambulance moved at normal speed again down the road. The field outside was empty. No light anywhere. Walter lay back against the stretcher, now breathing heavily again like before. He looked exhausted suddenly. I checked the clock overhead, 2:37 a.m. My stomach dropped instantly. There was no possible way nearly an hour had passed. The hospital should have been 15 minutes away by then. The radio erupted with dispatch traffic immediately afterward. They sounded pissed. Dispatch asked us to confirm status because they'd lost contact nearly 50 minutes earlier. They said multiple units tried reaching us. Even State Patrol attempted locating the ambulance after our GPS stopped updating. Curtis looked completely confused when I told him. He insisted the radio only cut out for maybe 30 seconds. At the hospital, things stayed strange. Walter barely remembered the drive. He only asked one question while nurses transferred him inside. He looked directly at me and asked, "Did you see it over the field too?" Before I could answer, they wheeled him away. Later that morning, dispatch called both of us into the supervisor's office to explain the radio silence. The GPS records showed the ambulance stopped on County Road 14 for 46 minutes. Completely stationary, but neither of us remembered stopping. The weirdest part came afterward while cleaning the rig. Underneath the ambulance along the passenger side, dried mud coated the lower panels almost halfway up the doors. Not road splash. Thick black soil packed into streaks, like we'd driven slowly through a soaked field. But neither of us remembered leaving the road once. I was hiking outside Flagstaff when this happened. There's a trail system north of town that cuts through the pine forest near several old transmission towers on the ridgeline. I'd done the route a few times before because it stayed quiet during weekdays and gave a good view of the valley once you climbed high enough. That evening, I started later than I should have. It was early October, still warm during the day, but cold after sunset. The sky stayed clear except for thin clouds moving fast over the mountains, and there was enough wind that the trees constantly hissed against each other. I planned on making a quick loop before dark. Instead, I lost track of time. By the time I turned back toward the parking area, the sun had already dropped behind the hills and most of the trail sat in shadow. The only things clearly visible above the tree line were the transmission towers farther up the ridge. They were huge steel structures carrying power lines across the forest. Red warning lights blinked near the tops because small planes sometimes crossed the area at night. I wasn't worried at first. I had a fully charged flashlight, decent weather, and maybe an hour walk back. The trail wound uphill briefly before descending toward the road again. Around that section, the trees thinned enough that you could see one of the towers standing above the ridgeline, maybe a quarter-mile away. That's where I first noticed the light. At first I thought it was another tower beacon, but it sat too low. The warning lights blinked red at the top of the structure, while this thing hovered beside the middle section of the tower itself. Bright white. Perfectly still. No flashing. I stopped walking because something about the distance felt wrong immediately. The light looked too large to be attached directly to the tower, but too close to it to be a helicopter or drone. The wind seemed quieter suddenly too. Not fully gone yet, just fading. I remember listening carefully because the forest had been loud all evening, branches creaking, dry needles moving across the ground. But now the only sound was the power lines humming faintly overhead. The white light remained fixed beside the tower, no movement at all. I pulled out my flashlight even though there was still enough dim light to see the trail. The beam looked strangely weak, not dead battery weak, just duller than before. I actually tapped the flashlight against my hand, thinking maybe the battery connection loosened while hiking. The beam brightened slightly again. Then I noticed the red warning lights on the tower. One blinked out, not flickered, just gone. A few seconds later, another disappeared farther up the structure. I stood there staring, trying to figure out if there'd been some kind of power issue. The white glow beside the tower drifted slightly upward, still silent. Still no visible shape around it beyond this pale oval haze. Then, another red light went dark. The tower suddenly looked enormous against the evening sky, with only 2 warning lights left blinking near the top. The forest around me had become completely still now. No wind, no insects, nothing. Even the power lines overhead sounded quieter somehow. That silence bothered me more than the light itself. I started walking again faster while keeping my eyes on the trail. The tower sat off to my left, uphill through the trees. Every few seconds I glanced back toward it. The white glow kept pace somehow, not physically moving through the forest, but remaining visible between gaps in the trees no matter where I walked. That's when I realized it was closer. I don't mean I watched it approach. I mean suddenly, the light appeared larger between the trunks than before. The remaining tower warning lights blinked once together. Then one failed. Only a single red light remained at the top now. My flashlight dimmed sharply. The beam shrank to maybe a few feet ahead of me. I cursed and checked the battery indicator. Dead. Completely dead. That made no sense because I'd charged it fully before leaving home. It was one of those expensive hiking flashlights that normally lasted days. I turned it off and back on again. Nothing but a faint glow. The forest darkened around me immediately. The last red tower light blinked once more, then went black. Every warning light on the tower had disappeared now. Only the white glow remained beside the structure. I remember the exact feeling that hit me then, because it wasn't panic yet. It was confusion mixed with this overwhelming sense that something was wrong with the environment itself. The air felt heavier, warmer too, despite the temperature dropping after sunset. I kept walking downhill faster, trying not to look back anymore. That lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard the humming, not from the power lines, lower, deep enough that I felt it through the ground before fully hearing it. I stopped instinctively. The vibration came in slow pulses. Whum! Several seconds later, again, whum! The trees around me vibrated faintly during each pulse. Loose needles drifted down from branches even though there was no wind. I looked uphill again, despite every instinct telling me not to. The white glow had moved away from the tower. Now it hovered above the tree line, closer than before, not racing toward me or anything dramatic, just slowly drifting between the dark outlines of the pines. The tower behind it remained completely dark. No warning lights had returned. I backed away down the trail while staring upward. The flashlight in my hand felt unusually warm, suddenly. I clicked it again out of reflex. The beam flashed once brightly enough to illuminate the trees. For half a second, I saw movement farther uphill between the trunks. Not clear shapes, just tall, dark forms crossing silently through the woods beneath the glow. Then the flashlight died completely. The humming deepened. Whump! Whump! I started moving fast after that. Not running because the trail had loose rocks everywhere, but fast enough that branches slapped against my shoulders as I descended. The glow remained visible through the trees off to my left the entire time. At one point, I became aware that the forest floor itself seemed brighter than it should have been. Not illuminated directly. More like the darkness had faded slightly around me. I remember tripping once on a root and catching myself against a tree trunk. The bark felt strangely warm. That detail stuck with me because the air had turned cold enough to see my breath again. I pulled my phone out to use the flashlight instead. No battery. The phone had been above 80% earlier. Now the screen wouldn't even turn on. The humming continued somewhere behind me. Steady. Slow. I finally reached a clearing where the trail crossed beneath the transmission lines directly. That was the worst moment of the whole thing. The power lines overhead weren't moving. At all. No wind touching them despite the height. They hung perfectly still against the darkening sky, and the white glow now hovered directly above the clearing ahead. Close enough that I could see the trees beneath it illuminated faintly silver. Still silent. Still no defined structure around it. The air smelled strange there too, like hot metal after rain, even though everything was dry. I stopped dead without meaning to. The humming became so strong I could feel it in my chest. Then every hair on my arm stood up at once. The glow drifted slightly lower. I remember hearing a clicking sound from somewhere inside the forest around the clearing. Not mechanical exactly, sharp and irregular, like branches snapping far away. I backed away slowly while trying not to fully look at the light anymore. Something about staring directly at it too long made my vision blur around the edges. Then came the strange part I still can't explain properly. The forest suddenly seemed brighter behind me. I turned expecting headlights from another hiker or ranger vehicle. Nothing there, but the trail downhill looked washed in pale light now too, as if the glow above the clearing illuminated everything at once without casting shadows. I realized then how quiet my own footsteps had become, almost muted. The humming stopped completely. Silence hit so hard my ears rang. Then the glow pulsed once. Not brighter exactly, more concentrated. The trees around the clearing flashed pale white for a split second, and every tower warning light on the ridge came back on simultaneously. Red lights blinking across the dark skyline all at once. The sudden normality of it scared me almost more than the silence had. Wind rushed through the trees again immediately afterward. The power lines resumed humming overhead. My phone vibrated in my pocket, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Battery back at 76%. Several missed notifications all arriving at once. I looked uphill one last time. The white glow was gone. The clearing sat dark and empty beneath the transmission tower. I made it back to the parking area around 9:40 p.m. My car clock said I'd been gone almost 3 hours longer than planned. The strangest thing came after I got home. The flashlight still wouldn't work despite fresh batteries. I assumed the electronics burned out somehow until 2 days later when I picked it up off the kitchen counter. The beam turned on instantly, full brightness, no flickering, no issues, but the lens smelled faintly like overheated wiring for weeks afterward. I was driving back from Louisville when this happened. It was late spring, maybe early May, and I'd stayed too long helping a friend move apartments. By the time I got on the highway, it was already close to midnight. The weather had turned strange during the drive too. Earlier it had been humid and warm, but around midnight, a thick mist started forming over the road. Not full fog exactly, just low patches drifting across the highway enough that headlights smeared slightly in front of you. Traffic was almost non-existent. I remember because long stretches of road felt completely empty except for the sound of my tires and the radio. I was somewhere outside Elizabethtown when the first weird thing happened. My radio cut out mid-song. Not static, just silence. The screen stayed lit, the station still displayed, but there was no audio at all. I tapped the volume knob a few times, thinking the speakers failed. Nothing. A few seconds later, the radio returned suddenly, like nothing happened. I honestly forgot about it almost immediately. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, I noticed the highway looked unusually bright ahead. There was an overpass coming up, crossing above the interstate, and the concrete underneath looked illuminated somehow. Not by headlights, more like a pale white glow spread across the underside of the bridge. At first, I assumed there was construction lighting overhead, or maybe a maintenance truck parked on top, but as I got closer, I couldn't see any source for the light. The bridge itself just seemed brighter than everything around it. The mist hanging near the overpass reflected the glow softly. I remember slowing slightly because it looked strange enough to catch my attention. The closer I got, the dimmer my headlights seemed. That part became obvious very quickly. The road ahead started fading into darkness even though my high beams were on. I actually checked the dashboard thinking maybe the lights malfunctioned. Everything looked normal inside the car except the beams themselves looked weak and washed out against the pale glow under the bridge. Then my phone charger disconnected by itself. The charging icon blinked on and off rapidly. At the same time, the radio audio became distorted, not static, more like deep muffled humming underneath the music. I reached the overpass maybe 5 seconds later. The entire underside of the bridge glowed dull white overhead. No visible fixtures, no cars crossing above, just brightness spread across the concrete. The mist under there looked thicker too, almost suspended. That's when the car suddenly felt wrong. Not mechanically wrong, physically wrong. The best way I can explain it is everything inside the car felt lighter. My arms against the steering wheel, my body against the seat. Even the loose water bottle in the cup holder lifted slightly and rattled against the plastic, not floating dramatically, just lighter, enough that my stomach dropped instantly because my body recognized something was deeply off before my brain caught up. The steering wheel resistance changed too. For maybe 3 or 4 seconds, it felt like the tires barely touched the road. The humming sound deepened hard then. Whum. I felt it through the seat and floorboards. The headlights dimmed almost completely beneath the bridge. Outside the windshield, the white glow overhead reflected across the hood of the car so brightly I could barely see the lanes. Then I noticed movement above me. Not on the bridge. Under it. A darker shape crossing slowly through the glow attached to the concrete overhead. At least I think that's what I saw. The shape moved too smoothly to be a person walking. More like a shadow sliding across water. I remember gripping the wheel so hard my fingers hurt. The weightless feeling intensified for maybe another second. Then everything snapped back instantly. The car slammed heavily onto the suspension like it had dropped an inch. The water bottle crashed sideways into the passenger footwell. Normal engine sound roared back into my ears. My headlights brightened fully again, and I was already past the bridge. I looked in the rearview mirror immediately. The overpass behind me looked completely normal now. Dark concrete, no glow, no traffic, just mist drifting across the highway. I kept driving for several miles trying to calm down and explain it logically. Exhaustion, micro-sleep, weird lighting conditions. Maybe I hit uneven pavement beneath the bridge, but none of it matched the feeling inside the car. About 10 minutes later, my phone finally buzzed with delayed notifications all arriving at once. Texts, email alerts, everything hitting simultaneously. I checked the clock then and got confused immediately. It was 1:14 a.m. I knew for a fact I passed through that area around 12:30 because I'd looked at the dashboard not long before the bridge. The missing time bothered me, but honestly I was more focused on convincing myself I hadn't imagined the weightless sensation. I eventually got home around 2. By then, rain had started lightly falling again. I parked in my apartment lot and sat inside the car for a while, replaying everything in my head. That's when I noticed the rear windshield. At first, I thought it was streaks from moisture. Then I realized they were fingerprints, several of them, on the outside of the rear glass. Long, pale prints dragged downward through the thin layer of dirt coating the window. Not handprints exactly, just fingertips. 5 or 6 distinct marks near the center of the windshield, higher up than seemed natural too, almost near the top edge of the glass. I got out and checked immediately. The prints were definitely outside, fresh enough that the rain hadn't washed them away yet. I remember standing there staring because nobody had been near my car all night. The weirdest part was the spacing. The fingertips looked slightly too long, not grotesque or anything dramatic, just narrow and stretched compared to normal prints. I wiped them away almost immediately because they bothered me that much. But while cleaning the glass, I noticed another detail. The roof of the car felt unusually warm. Not engine warmth. The actual metal roof above the rear seats stayed warm to the touch despite the cold rain falling around it. The next morning, I checked my dash cam footage, hoping maybe I'd accidentally recorded something useful. The file covering the bridge crossing existed. But right before the overpass, the image quality degraded badly. The screen filled with pale distortion and rolling static-like interference. No audio except deep humming. Then the footage froze completely for nearly 11 minutes. Not corrupted, frozen on a single frame of the glowing underside of the bridge. After the freeze ended, the recording resumed several miles farther down the highway. The timestamp jumped from 12:31 a.m. to 12:42. Same road, same weather. No transition at all. I watched that frozen frame probably 20 times afterward. At first, it just looked like bright concrete under the overpass. But eventually, I noticed something near the top corner of the image. A dark shape partially visible against the glow overhead. Not clear enough to identify. Just something hanging beneath the bridge where nothing should have been. I lived in a 4-story apartment block in Portland for about a year when this happened. The building sat around a square concrete courtyard with all the balconies facing inward. Old place. Thin walls, flickering hallway lights, pipes always clanking at night. Mostly students and older tenants who'd been there forever. The courtyard had one dead fountain in the middle and a couple weak lamps that barely lit anything after midnight. This happened in November during a stretch of heavy fog that rolled in every evening from the river. The air smelled damp constantly, and the fog got thick enough some nights that you couldn't clearly see the buildings across the courtyard. I remember going to bed around 11 because I had work early. At some point during the night, I woke up thinking somebody was vacuuming outside. That was honestly my first thought. A low humming noise echoed through the apartment, steady and deep enough that I could feel it faintly through the mattress. I checked my phone, 3:11 a.m. The humming continued without changing pitch. Not loud exactly, but impossible to ignore once awake. I remember lying there listening for maybe a minute, trying to identify it. The building made all kinds of weird noises normally, but this sounded different, too smooth, too constant. Then I noticed something else. Nobody else in the building was making noise. No TVs through the walls, no footsteps upstairs, nothing. The entire apartment block felt dead quiet, except for that hum. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. The sound seemed stronger near the balcony door. Outside, fog pressed against the glass thick enough that the courtyard lamps looked blurry and oversized. I cracked the balcony door slightly. The air outside felt weirdly warm for November. Not warm like heated air from vents. Damp and heavy, and the humming immediately became louder. It echoed around the courtyard from somewhere below. I stepped onto the balcony. At first, I couldn't see much besides fog moving slowly between the buildings. Then I noticed the light, dull white, hovering above the courtyard near the dead fountain, not bright enough to illuminate everything clearly. More like a soft glow suspended in the fog. It sat maybe 15 feet off the ground, completely still. The fog around it drifted strangely too, not naturally with the breeze. It seemed to curl inward toward the light slightly. I leaned farther over the railing, trying to figure out what I was looking at. No drone noise, no visible cables, nothing supporting it. The humming deepened slightly while I watched. That's when I realized several other apartment windows were open too. Not fully, just cracked slightly. I could see silhouettes standing behind curtains or on balconies across the courtyard. Nobody spoke. Nobody shouted questions. People just stood there silently staring downward toward the glow. That part unsettled me badly afterward. Normally, if something weird happened in the building, somebody always yelled or complained immediately. But that night, everyone seemed strangely quiet. I spotted old Mrs. Delaney from the second floor standing perfectly still beside her window in a bathrobe staring toward the courtyard. A younger guy from Building C leaned against his balcony rail without moving. None of them looked at each other. Only at the light. The humming pulsed once harder then. Whum! I felt it through the metal balcony railing beneath my hand. The courtyard lamps dimmed slightly for maybe 2 seconds before returning to normal brightness. The white glow remained unchanged. I should have gone back inside right then, honestly, but something about the whole thing felt weirdly difficult to pull away from. Not hypnotic exactly, just absorbing. The longer I stared, the more the fog seemed to flatten around the light, like depth perception stopped working properly. At one point, I noticed movement near the fountain beneath the glow. Not clear figures, more like shadows shifting through the fog. I remember blinking several times trying to focus because every time I looked directly at the area, the shapes disappeared again. The humming continued. Whum, whum, slow and steady. I looked down at the courtyard entrance expecting security or police or literally anyone responding to the noise. Nobody came. Then all at once the sound stopped. Instantly. The silence afterward felt unnatural. Even distant traffic noise from the city vanished. No cars, no sirens, nothing. The fog itself seemed motionless now between the buildings. The white glow drifted slightly upward, still silent, still partly obscured. That's when the hallway light inside my apartment flickered rapidly behind me. I turned instinctively. The bulb dimmed nearly black before stabilizing again. When I looked back outside, the glow had moved closer to my side of the courtyard. Not fast, just suddenly nearer somehow. I remember becoming aware of another sound then, very faint breathing. At first I thought it was mine. Then I realized it came from neighboring balconies around the courtyard. People standing silently in the dark, breathing while watching the light. No one spoke, no one moved. I finally stepped back inside and shut the balcony door completely because the whole situation suddenly felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain logically. The humming started again immediately once the door latched. Louder this time. The dishes in my kitchen cabinets rattled faintly. I checked my phone intending to record the sound. No signal. Battery at 1% even though I'd charged it before bed. Then the apartment lights dimmed. Not fully out, just fading pale for several seconds. The humming intensified enough that I could feel it through the floorboards now. I looked through the curtains again. The white glow hovered almost level with the third floor balconies now. Close enough that I could see fog swirling around it in tight patterns. Still no defined edges, just dull white light hanging in the courtyard. One balcony across from mine stood completely open. A man I didn't recognize stood there motionless in pajamas, staring directly toward the glow. His posture looked strange somehow. Too still. Then every apartment light facing the courtyard flickered at once. The glow brightened slightly. And all the silhouettes disappeared from the windows simultaneously. Not walking away. Gone. Like everyone stepped backward at the exact same moment. That honestly scared me enough that I backed away from the curtains completely. The humming continued another minute maybe, then stopped. Normal city noise rushed back gradually afterward. A car horn somewhere distant, pipes clanking upstairs, wind outside. I don't remember falling asleep again. I think exhaustion just eventually knocked me out near dawn. The next morning, the whole building felt off. People avoided eye contact in the hallways. Several tenants looked exhausted like they hadn't slept. I ran into Mrs. Delaney checking her mail downstairs and casually asked if she'd heard the humming overnight. She froze for a second before answering. Then she said yes, very quietly, and immediately changed the subject. The younger guy from Building C stood outside smoking while staring into the courtyard. I asked if he saw the light. He nodded once. Then, after a long silence, he asked, "Did you dream last night?" I told him I wasn't sure. That wasn't completely true. I remembered fragments of dreams unusually clearly. Long hallways, fog, standing water somewhere underground. but the details felt slippery the harder I tried remembering them. The guy nodded slowly when I hesitated. Then he said, "Yeah," and walked away before I could ask anything else. Throughout the day, more tenants started talking quietly about strange dreams. Not openly, though, almost embarrassed. One woman near the laundry room mentioned waking up crying without knowing why. Another tenant told the property manager he kept hearing the humming after sunrise, even though it stopped hours earlier. The weirdest conversation happened that evening. I got into the elevator with a middle-aged man from the fourth floor named Victor. We'd talked plenty before. Friendly guy. He looked exhausted. Huge dark circles under his eyes. After a minute, he asked me if I'd been awake around 3. I said yes. He stared at the elevator floor for several seconds before speaking again. Then he quietly said, "I don't want to describe what I dreamed about. Not, I had a bad dream. Not nightmare." Exactly that. I asked what he meant. He shook his head immediately. "No," he said, "I don't think we should talk about it." The elevator opened and he left without another word. That night, several tenants kept their curtains closed facing the courtyard. A few people even taped blankets over balcony windows. Around midnight, I stepped outside briefly to throw away trash. The courtyard looked completely normal again. Fog drifted lightly near the fountain. Weak lamps buzzed overhead. But in the center of the concrete near the dead fountain, there was a circular patch of moisture that hadn't dried with the rest of the courtyard. A pale ring, maybe 10 feet wide. Perfectly smooth. No footprints through it at all. I was driving back from Baton Rouge when this happened. I'd gone down there for a friend's engagement party and stayed later than I meant to because the weather turned bad. By the time I finally left, it was after midnight and the storm had mostly passed, leaving everything wet and windy. The drive home took me north along a stretch of highway that crossed the Atchafalaya Basin. Long bridges over dark water and marshland with almost no lighting except reflectors and occasional overhead lamps. I remember the wind being strong enough to shake the car slightly whenever I crossed exposed sections of road. The weird part started near one of the older river bridges about an hour into the drive. Traffic was almost non-existent. I hadn't passed another car in several minutes. The bridge itself stretched long and low over black water with metal guardrails on both sides. No buildings nearby. Just swamp and river disappearing into darkness. As soon as I started crossing, I noticed the water below looked strange. Not rough. Still. That immediately stood out because the wind overhead hammered the bridge hard enough to whistle around the side mirrors. Trees along the shoreline bent visibly in gusts. But the river beneath looked flat as glass, no ripples, no movement. At first I assumed the angle from the bridge just hid the current somehow. Then I noticed the glow, a soft white light moving beneath the surface directly below my side of the bridge. Not deep underwater either, maybe just under the surface itself. It paced the car perfectly. Every time I accelerated slightly, the glow kept up. When I eased off the gas, it slowed too. I remember gripping the wheel harder because my brain immediately tried turning it into reflections from my headlights or bridge lights, except there weren't enough lights on the bridge to create anything like that, and the glow came from beneath the water. It stayed beside the car, matching speed exactly. The strangest part was the river itself remained perfectly smooth around it. No wake, no ripples, nothing. I rolled my window down slightly to listen. The wind roared overhead immediately, but below that, I noticed another sound, a low humming vibration. Not from the engine, deeper. It seemed to come through the bridge itself. Whum! A few seconds later again. Whum! I glanced into the side mirror, expecting maybe another vehicle with bright lights behind me causing reflections. The highway behind me sat completely empty. The glow below remained level with the driver's side door now, still pacing me. Then my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down automatically. No signal. At the exact same moment, my music cut out. Not paused. Gone completely silent. The dashboard display stayed active, but the speakers produced nothing. The wind outside suddenly sounded distant too. Muffled somehow. I looked back toward the river. The glow had moved closer to the surface. Bright enough now that I could see pale light spreading beneath the water, like something large moving just underneath. The bridge ahead stretched empty through darkness. That's when I noticed how quiet the tires sounded against the pavement, almost muted. The humming deepened again. Whum! The steering wheel vibrated faintly during each pulse. I reached for my phone, thinking maybe recording video would help later. The screen unlocked normally at first. Then every photo from that evening vanished in front of me. I know how insane that sounds, but I watched it happen. I opened my camera roll because I wanted to check the party photos I'd taken earlier. The gallery showed dozens of thumbnails for half a second. Then they disappeared one by one, blank gray boxes replacing them. Not deleted selectively either. Everything from that evening gone. The phone lagged hard in my hand while it happened. I nearly drifted across the lane because I kept staring down trying to understand what I was seeing. When I looked back toward the river again, the glow had shifted directly beneath the bridge. Not beside my car anymore, underneath, pacing me from below. The river still hadn't moved once despite the wind. I remember becoming intensely aware of how isolated the bridge felt suddenly. No headlights ahead, no headlights behind. Nothing except darkness and that pale light beneath the water. Then came the pressure change. My ears popped sharply, like rapid altitude change inside an airplane. The humming grew stronger immediately afterward. Whum! Whum! The entire car felt lighter for a second. Not floating, just strangely loose against the road. Loose change in the cup holder rattled softly upward during the next pulse. That was the moment real panic hit. I pressed harder on the gas. The glow matched my speed instantly, still directly below. Then something moved in the water around it, not splashing, more like darker shapes shifting beneath the pale light. I couldn't make out details because every time I focused directly downward, my vision blurred strangely. I remember checking the rearview mirror again, hoping another car would appear. Still nothing. The bridge lights ahead started dimming slightly then, not fully going out. Just fading pale one by one farther down the span. The glow beneath the river brightened in response. The water directly above it looked wrong suddenly, too smooth, like polished glass instead of moving river water. The humming stopped, instantly. The silence afterward terrified me more than the sound had. No wind, no engine noise, nothing. I could still feel the car moving, but heard absolutely none of it. Then the glow rose closer beneath the surface. Close enough that the underside of the bridge rail reflected faint white light upward. I looked down through the driver window and saw something long moving below the glow. Not clear enough to identify, just a darker outline beneath the illuminated water. I jerked my eyes back to the road immediately. At that exact second, every bridge light ahead went dark together. For maybe 2 seconds, the only illumination came from the pale glow beneath the river. Then normal sound slammed back violently. Wind hit the car hard enough to shake it sideways. The engine roared loud in my ears. Music blasted suddenly through the speakers at full volume, and the bridge lights returned. I almost lost control, swerving slightly before correcting. The river below looked normal again. Black water with rough, wind-driven ripples. No glow anywhere. I sped off the bridge without slowing again until I reached the next exit area several miles later. I pulled into a gas station, shaking badly enough, I spilled coffee trying to pour it. The first thing I checked was my phone. All the photos from that evening were still gone. Not hidden, not corrupted. Just missing entirely between 8:14 p.m. and 12:53 a.m. Everything before remained untouched. The strangest part came when I checked the time. 1:49 a.m. The bridge crossing should have taken maybe 5 minutes max. According to the dashboard clock, nearly 40 minutes had passed since I first drove onto it. I sat in that gas station parking lot trying to reconstruct the drive and couldn't. The last weird thing happened when I finally got home. While grabbing my bag from the back seat, I noticed moisture across the rear passenger window. Not rain, condensation. And drawn through the condensation from the outside were several long streaks, parallel lines, like fingertips dragged slowly downward across the glass. Too narrow and evenly spaced to look normal. I lived alone on a cattle farm outside Salina, Kansas when this happened. The property had been in my family a long time, mostly pasture land with one old barn, a few outbuildings, and several fenced fields stretching out behind the house toward a creek line. The nearest neighbor sat almost 2 miles away. Most nights out there were loud in their own way. Coyotes in the distance, crickets, wind moving through grass. You got used to a constant layer of sound, even when everything looked empty. This happened in late August during a dry spell. Hot days, cooler nights, and dust everywhere because we hadn't had real rain in weeks. I woke up around 1:30 in the morning because the dogs started acting strange. Not barking. That's what bothered me. Both dogs slept on the enclosed back porch usually. If coyotes or deer came near the pasture, they'd lose their minds barking. But that night they only whined softly. I remember lying there listening for a minute before getting up. The house felt unusually warm despite having the windows open. Heavy air, completely still. When I stepped onto the porch, both dogs stood pressed against the screen door, staring toward the far pasture, ears flat, not making a sound. I looked out expecting maybe another animal had gotten through the fence. Instead, I noticed all the cattle gathered together near the north end of the pasture, every single one of them, just standing there tightly packed near the fence line, silent. That alone felt wrong immediately. Cattle make noise constantly at night, moving around, snorting, shifting through grass, but the entire field looked frozen. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen and stepped outside. The sky was clear enough to see stars, though there was a thin haze hanging low over the pasture. No moon that night either, which made the field darker than usual except for the distant yard light near the barn. The dogs refused to follow me off the porch. They stayed by the door, whining under their breath. As I crossed the yard, I noticed the cattle weren't looking at me. All of them stared upward toward the same point over the field. Not panicked, not running, just standing perfectly still with their heads tilted slightly up. That's when I saw the light. At first I thought it was a low cloud reflecting something. A faint circular glow hung above the pasture, maybe 50 feet over the ground. Not bright, more like dull white haze against the night sky. Perfectly motionless, no beam shining down, no blinking lights, nothing. It sat directly above the gathered cattle. I stopped walking immediately, trying to understand what I was seeing. The weirdest part was how difficult it felt to judge distance. Sometimes it looked huge and high above the pasture. Other times it seemed much lower. The cattle remained silent beneath it. Even the insects had gone quiet. No crickets, no frogs from the creek, nothing. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward the field. The beam looked weak instantly. Not dead battery weak exactly, just strangely faded. I remember sweeping the light across the cattle expecting at least some movement. None of them reacted. They stood shoulder to shoulder staring upward. The circular glow remained perfectly still above them. Then I noticed another sound, low humming, not coming from the sky exactly, more like vibration carried through the ground. I felt it faintly through my boots before fully hearing it. Whum! Several seconds later again. Whum! The cattle shifted slightly during each pulse, but never broke formation. I started walking toward the pasture gate despite every instinct telling me not to. Part of me thought maybe a transformer or power line nearby was malfunctioning, but there weren't any power poles near that field. The closer I got, the stranger the air felt. Warmer, heavy enough that breathing seemed harder. The flashlight dimmed further until it barely illuminated the grass ahead of me. I smacked it against my palm. Nothing changed. Then one of the cows nearest the fence slowly turned its head toward me. That startled me more than anything else so far because its eyes reflected oddly in the weak beam. Not glowing, just washed pale white instead of the usual yellow-green reflection. The humming deepened. Whum, whum. The circular light overhead brightened slightly during each pulse. Still no movement, no sound from it directly. I reached the fence line maybe 30 yards from the herd and stopped. The cattle stood clustered tightly beneath the glow now. Some of them trembled slightly, but none tried to run. I remember becoming intensely aware of how silent my own footsteps sounded in the grass. Even the wind had stopped completely. Then I noticed movement near the center of the herd. Not clear movement, more like shifting shadows crossing between the animals. I raised the flashlight instinctively. The beam flickered once and died completely. Total darkness hit except for the pale circular glow above the field. That's when the humming stopped. Instantly. The silence afterward felt unbearable. I could hear my own breathing loudly. Nothing else. Then, one of the cows made a strange noise. Not a moo exactly, more like low, strained breathing. The entire herd slowly began turning together toward the far side of the pasture, still silent, still packed tightly. As they shifted, I realized the circular glow wasn't directly above them anymore. It had moved closer to me, not traveling through the sky, just suddenly nearer somehow. The edges looked less defined now, almost transparent against the stars. I remember backing away from the fence without taking my eyes off it. The air pressure felt wrong suddenly. My ears popped hard enough to hurt. Then the dogs back at the house started barking violently all at once. The sound shattered the silence. Immediately afterward, the cattle scattered, not stampeding, just breaking formation quickly across the pasture. The circular glow dimmed sharply. For half a second, I thought I saw something darker suspended beneath it. A shape, maybe. Impossible to describe properly because it vanished the second I focused directly on it. Then the glow disappeared entirely. No movement away, no fading upward, just gone. Normal night sounds rushed back almost immediately. Crickets, wind through grass, frogs near the creek. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to convince myself I'd misinterpreted everything. The cattle kept moving nervously around the field now, making noise again like normal animals. My flashlight suddenly turned back on in my hand, bright as ever. That part honestly scared me enough that I went straight back inside. I locked the doors even though I felt ridiculous doing it. I barely slept afterward. Around sunrise, I walked the pasture checking for anything unusual. At first, everything looked normal besides the cattle acting skittish near the north fence line. Then I found the wire. One section of barbed fence near the corner post had been twisted tightly into knots. Not broken, twisted. Several strands wrapped around each other in tight spirals like soft rope. I crouched there staring at it for probably a full minute because it made absolutely no sense physically. Barbed wire under that kind of tension should have snapped. Instead, it looked carefully wound together by hand, except tighter than hands could realistically manage. The fence posts themselves weren't damaged at all, just the wire between them. I noticed another strange detail then. The grass beneath that section of fence had been flattened in a rough circle maybe 20 feet across. Not burned, just pressed down and dead quiet. No insects anywhere inside that patch. While I stood there, my dogs refused to come closer than the gate entrance behind me. They stayed back growling softly toward the flattened grass. The strangest thing happened later that afternoon. I was repairing the fence when one of the cattle wandered near the corner post and stopped. It stared upward again at the empty sky exactly the way the herd had during the night. Then several others nearby did the same thing. I went to a late showing of a movie in Tulsa when this happened. Nothing unusual about the night at first. It was early March, cold and windy after sunset, and the theater sat inside one of those giant shopping centers, surrounded by huge parking lots and half-empty storefronts. The movie ended around 12:40 a.m. By then the place was mostly dead. A few employees cleaning inside, maybe 10 cars left in the lot, and one security vehicle parked near the entrance with its lights off. I remember the weather clearly because the wind had been strong all evening. You could hear it rattling loose cart corrals outside whenever the theater doors opened. I walked out carrying a drink cup and immediately noticed how bright the parking lot looked. Not brighter from the overhead lamps. Different. The parked cars reflected this pale white light across their roofs and windows like a spotlight was shining down somewhere nearby. At first I thought maybe a helicopter was overhead. But when I looked up, the sky looked empty. Low clouds moved fast across the city glow, but there was no visible source for the light. The theater lamps themselves still burned yellow-orange like normal. Yet every car in the lot reflected that same dull white sheen. Even the pavement looked washed out. I stopped walking for a second, trying to figure it out. A couple other people leaving the movie noticed too. I remember one guy near the entrance actually shielding his eyes and looking upward. Nothing there. No sound either. No helicopter blades. No plane. Just wind. Or at least there had been wind, because about halfway across the parking lot I realized the air had gone strangely still. The loose trash blowing across the asphalt earlier had stopped moving completely. The flags near the storefronts hung limp. Even the humming from the parking lot lights sounded quieter somehow. I kept walking toward my car anyway while glancing upward every few seconds. That's when the first car alarm went off. A sedan near the far row suddenly started blaring. The headlights flashed twice, then stopped. A few seconds later, another alarm farther down the lot activated. Then, another. One after another in perfect sequence moving across the parking lot. Not random overlapping alarms like normal. Each one started only after the previous one stopped. I remember slowing down because the pattern felt deliberate somehow. The alarms continued advancing steadily row by row closer toward where my car was parked. Nobody else seemed to know what to do. A woman near an SUV stood frozen holding grocery bags while the alarms moved past her position. Another guy started clicking his key fob repeatedly trying to shut his own car off before it even activated. The white glow reflecting off the cars seemed brighter now too. Still no source in the sky. That bothered me more than the alarms, honestly. The reflections kept shifting faintly across windows and windshields, like something overhead moved slowly above the lot, but whenever I looked up, there was nothing visible. Then my phone lost signal. Not just low bars. No service entirely. At the same time, the parking lot lights dimmed slightly, not enough to go dark. Just enough that the white reflections stood out even more. The alarms kept progressing through the rows. Closer, closer, always one at a time, perfect spacing between each. That's when I heard the humming, low and deep, barely audible beneath the alarms. I felt it more than heard it honestly, like vibration through the asphalt under my shoes. Whum. A few seconds later again. Whum. Whum. The nearest parked cars vibrated faintly during each pulse. You could see side mirrors trembling. I remember looking toward the security vehicle expecting someone to intervene or at least drive over. The guard sat inside motionless, not asleep exactly, just sitting still facing upward through the windshield. The next car alarm in the sequence belonged to a truck 2 spaces away from mine. Its headlights flashed hard enough to reflect across my windshield. Then silence. My own car alarm activated immediately afterward. The horn blasted once, the lights flashed, then everything stopped. All the alarms, all at once. The parking lot became dead quiet. Even the city noise beyond the shopping center seemed muted suddenly. I stood there beside my car listening. No wind, no traffic, nothing. The pale white reflections remained spread across every vehicle around me. Then I noticed the shadow, not on the ground, moving across the tops of the parked cars. A darker shape gliding silently through the reflected glow. At first I thought clouds overhead finally shifted, but the motion looked wrong, too smooth. The shadow crossed several rows without changing shape, and still there was nothing visible in the sky. The humming deepened sharply. Whum! This pulse hit hard enough that I felt it in my chest. Several car windows fogged instantly from the inside despite the cold weather. I backed away from my car without really deciding to. Something about the entire parking lot suddenly felt empty in a bad way. Not abandoned. Paused. The people near the theater entrance stood motionless now too, everyone looking upward. I remember realizing I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore. The asphalt swallowed sound completely. The white glow intensified slightly. Reflections crawled across the parked cars as though something massive moved silently overhead just beyond visibility. Then my headlights flicked on by themselves. Not fully, just dim, pale beams glowing weakly across the pavement. The interior dome light activated too. I could see my keys still in my hand, nowhere near the ignition. The humming continued. Whum. Whum. During the next pulse, every parking lot light around us dimmed simultaneously. For half a second, the entire lot became almost completely lit only by that pale overhead glow. That was the moment I saw it. Or part of it, maybe. A faint circular outline above the parking lot. Not solid, more like distortion against the clouds. Huge, silent. The edges blurred every time I tried focusing directly on them. I remember becoming intensely dizzy suddenly. The rows of parked cars looked stretched somehow. Distances felt wrong. Then every car in the lot flashed headlights simultaneously. One enormous burst of white light. The humming stopped. Normal sounds slammed back immediately afterward. Wind roared through the lot again, hard enough to move shopping carts nearby. Traffic noise returned from the highway. Someone yelled near the theater entrance, and the white reflections vanished completely. The parking lot looked normal again. Yellow lights, dark sky, no glow overhead. People around me started moving all at once, like everyone collectively snapped awake. Several drivers hurried to their cars immediately. The security vehicle finally started moving too. I stood there for a few seconds trying to calm down before unlocking my own car. Nothing happened. No lights, no click from the locks. Dead. I tried again. Completely dead battery. That made no sense because I'd replaced it less than 2 months earlier. I got inside manually with the key and turned the ignition. Nothing at all. Not even dashboard lights. Meanwhile, cars around me started leaving the lot normally. Engines starting. Headlights moving. Only my car seemed affected. I eventually flagged down the security guard for a jump. The guy looked pale and distracted when he stepped out of his vehicle. I asked if he saw what happened with the lights. He hesitated a long time before answering. Then he said quietly, "I thought there was something above us." That was it. No explanation after. While hooking jumper cables up, he stopped suddenly and stared at the roof of my car. I asked what was wrong. He pointed upward. There were long streaks across the dust on the roof near the rear windshield. Not scratches, more like marks dragged through condensation. Several parallel lines curving across the metal, too high up and evenly spaced to look accidental. I didn't say anything about them. Neither did he. After the jump finally worked, my dashboard clock blinked 1:58 a.m. The movie ended around 12:40. There was no way nearly an hour and 20 minutes had passed in that parking lot. I rented a storage unit outside Albuquerque for about 6 months when I was between apartments. Nothing valuable in there, really. Mostly furniture, boxes of old clothes, tools, and some stuff from my dad's garage after he passed. The place sat on the edge of an industrial area near the highway. Rows of metal storage buildings surrounded by chain link fencing and bright floodlights that stayed on all night. I usually visited during the day, but this happened after work one night because I needed to grab a toolbox before an early job the next morning. It was late September. Hot during the day, but cooler after sunset. That night, the wind had picked up hard enough to blow dust across the roads, and the whole city smelled like rain, even though the storm never fully arrived. I got to the storage facility around 10:40 p.m. The office was already closed except for one security guard sitting inside the booth near the entrance gate watching TV. He recognized me enough to wave me through without checking ID. The facility felt strangely empty that night. Usually you'd hear rolling doors slamming somewhere or people moving stuff around late, but the rows looked dead quiet under the floodlights. My unit sat near the back corner of Building F. As soon as I parked, I noticed something weird. There was light coming from inside my unit. Not bright enough to spill across the pavement, just faint white glow leaking through the cracks around the roll-up door. At first, I honestly thought somebody had broken in and was inside with a flashlight. I killed the engine immediately and sat there listening. Nothing. No movement. No voices. The glow remained steady around the edges of the door. What bothered me immediately was the color. Not yellow like fluorescent lights, not blue like LEDs, just dull white. Almost soft looking somehow. I checked the lock from where I stood beside the truck, still secured. No visible damage. The glow pulsed faintly once behind the metal door. I remember actually backing up a step because my first thought was electrical fire. Maybe somehow one of the overhead facility lights reflected strangely inside, but the inside of the unit had no power at all. No outlets. Nothing electrical besides an old battery lantern I kept in one box. I walked closer slowly. The air near the unit felt oddly warm despite the wind moving through the rows, and the closer I got, the quieter everything became. The highway noise faded. The rattling fence near the edge of the property seemed to disappear. Even my footsteps sounded muffled against the concrete. I stopped directly in front of the door, listening hard. That's when I noticed the humming. Low. Barely audible. Not coming from outside exactly. More like vibration through the metal door itself. Whum. Several seconds later again. Whum. I touched the padlock first. Cold. Normal. Then I grabbed the handle and unlocked the unit. The second the door rolled upward, the glow vanished. Completely. Not fading. Gone instantly. Inside looked dark except for the weak facility lights spilling in from behind me. Everything appeared exactly where I'd left it. Old couch against the wall, boxes stacked near the back, bicycle, hanging from hooks, nothing disturbed. The humming stopped too. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to adjust my eyes because for a second I genuinely wondered if I'd imagined the glow. Then I smelled something strange. Hot metal. Not burning exactly, more like overheated machinery after running too long. The smell came from deeper inside the unit. I grabbed my phone flashlight and stepped in carefully. Everything looked untouched at first. Dust patterns on the floor still intact, no footprints besides mine, no open boxes. Then I noticed the shelf. There was a tall metal storage shelf against the back wall where I kept paint cans and old tools. The beam from my phone reflected oddly off it, almost hazy. I walked closer and realized the shelf itself looked wet somehow, not with liquid, more like heat distortion rising around it. The smell grew stronger too. I reached out automatically to touch the metal frame. The second my fingers made contact, pain shot through my hand hard enough that I jerked backward and swore out loud. The shelf was hot, not slightly warm, hot enough to sting like touching a car hood in summer. I stared at it completely confused because the rest of the unit felt cool. The heat came only from the shelf itself. Even stranger, nothing sitting on the shelves appeared damaged. Plastic bins untouched. Cardboard boxes normal, only the metal frame radiated heat. I touched it again briefly to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Still burning hot. The humming returned then, very faint. Whum. I froze immediately. The sound came from somewhere behind the shelf, or maybe inside the wall. It was impossible to place. My phone flashlight dimmed suddenly, not dead battery dim, more like the beam lost strength. I remember checking the screen and seeing my battery percentage dropping rapidly. 32, 27, 21. The humming deepened. Hum. Something shifted softly near the back corner of the unit. Not a clear movement. More like a shadow crossing behind stacked boxes. I stepped backward instantly. The facility lights outside flickered once, then steadied. The shelf remained intensely hot. Heat waves distorted the air around it visibly now in my flashlight beam. That made no sense at all because there was no heat source nearby. No wiring, no sunlight during the day, nothing. Then I noticed another detail. The dust on the concrete floor near the shelf had been disturbed. Not footprints, circular marks, faint curved lines overlapping each other near the base of the shelving unit. Like something heavy rotated slightly in place. The humming stopped abruptly. Silence rushed in hard afterward. No wind, no distant traffic, nothing. The inside of the storage unit suddenly felt much larger than before. Darker somehow, despite the open door. I backed out immediately after that. The second I crossed the threshold, normal sound returned all at once. Wind rattling doors farther down the row, highway traffic, a plane overhead. I stood outside, breathing hard while staring back into the unit. Everything looked completely ordinary now. No glow, no humming. The shelf still shimmered slightly with heat, though. I closed and locked the unit without grabbing the toolbox. Honestly, I just wanted to leave. As I walked back toward the truck, I noticed several other storage doors along the row standing slightly open. That stopped me cold because I could have sworn they were closed when I arrived. Not wide open. Just cracked a few inches. No movement inside any of them. No people anywhere in the facility. I got in the truck and drove straight back toward the entrance gate. The security guard stepped outside the booth when I stopped near him. He looked annoyed at first until I asked if maintenance had been working near Building F that night. He said no. I asked if anyone else entered the facility after me. Again, he said no. Then he frowned slightly and added, "Actually, nobody's come through for over an hour." That confused me because I'd only been inside maybe 15 minutes. I mentioned the strange light in my unit and the heat from the shelf. He gave me this look like he thought I was messing with him. Then he said something that honestly bothered me more than anything else. He told me the camera feed near Building F went white around the time I entered that row. Not black. White. He said every camera facing that direction showed nothing but pale static for several minutes. I asked if he saw anyone near my unit during that time. He shook his head. Then he said, "Far as I could tell, nobody entered that building at all." When I got home later, I realized the tips of my fingers were red where I touched the shelf. Not burned badly, just irritated like mild heat exposure. The next afternoon I went back during daylight with a friend because I didn't want to open the unit alone again. Everything looked normal. The shelf was cool, no smell, no glow. But the circular marks in the dust near the back wall were still there, and one of the cardboard boxes sitting on the middle shelf had changed position slightly. Not moved far, just rotated enough that the taped label now faced the wall instead of outward. I worked nights as a janitor at a middle school outside Spokane for about a year. The job itself was easy most of the time. Empty classrooms, long hallways, cleaning bathrooms, buffing floors. Once the teachers left around 5 p.m., the building got quiet fast. The school was old too, built sometime in the 70s with those long beige hallways and heavy metal doors that echoed whenever they closed. At night, the place always felt bigger than it did during the day. This happened in late November during basketball season. A snowstorm had moved through earlier that evening, and by midnight, the parking lot outside was buried under fresh snow reflecting the security lights. Wind rattled against the windows hard enough that parts of the building creaked occasionally. I was working alone that night because the other custodian called in sick. Around 11:30 p.m., I finished cleaning the cafeteria and started heading toward the gymnasium wing to empty trash before locking up. The gym sat at the far end of the school near the locker rooms. Big double doors with narrow windows running vertically through the center. Above those were larger windows near the ceiling facing outside toward the parking lot. I'd already shut the gym lights off earlier around 9. I remembered specifically because the main overheads took forever to warm back up once turned off. As I came down the hallway toward the gym, I noticed light reflecting across the floor ahead. Bright white. At first I assumed maybe someone from maintenance came in without telling me, but the closer I got, the stranger it looked. The light coming through the gym windows wasn't normal fluorescent light. Too white, almost colorless, and way brighter than the overhead gym lights should have been. The hallway walls glowed pale from it. I stopped probably 20 feet from the doors listening. Nothing. No bouncing basketballs, no voices, no movement inside, just the wind outside hitting the building. Then even that seemed to fade slightly. I walked closer slowly. The narrow windows in the gym doors were glowing completely white now. Not enough to blind me, but bright enough that I couldn't see through them into the gym itself. It looked almost like heavy fog illuminated from inside. That's when I noticed the smell. Hot electronics, like overheated wiring or a projector left running too long. It drifted faintly through the crack beneath the doors. My first thought, honestly, was electrical fire. I hurried the last few steps and grabbed the handle. The second the doors opened, the light vanished. Instantly. The gym beyond sat completely dark. No glow anywhere, only weak emergency lighting from exit signs near the far walls. I stood there frozen, holding the door open because the change happened so suddenly it felt impossible. 1 second, bright white light. The next, total darkness. The smell remained though. Hot metal and electronics. Not smoke exactly, just overheated air. I stepped inside and reached for the wall switch panel near the entrance. The overhead gym lights clicked on one by one slowly. Normal yellow-white lighting spread across the court. Empty bleachers, basketball hoops, nothing unusual, no people anywhere. I walked halfway across the gym, checking the corners and equipment rooms because I genuinely thought somebody had been inside. Everything looked untouched, no equipment left out, no open doors, nothing. But the smell got stronger near center court. I remember stopping directly on the school logo painted in the middle of the floor because the air there felt strangely warm compared to the rest of the gym. Not hot, just warmer. I looked upward instinctively. The ceiling disappeared into dark rafters far above the lights. For some reason, I became aware of how quiet the gym suddenly was, not silent exactly, but muffled, like sound didn't travel correctly. Even my footsteps across the polished floor sounded softer than normal. Then the lights flickered once overhead. Every fixture dimmed slightly at the same time. The smell intensified sharply. I backed toward the entrance immediately after that. Not panicking yet, just uncomfortable enough that I wanted another person nearby. As I reached the doors, my radio crackled loudly on my belt. Static. Deep, pulsing interference. Whump. Several seconds later again. The sound vibrated through the metal door handles beneath my hand. I tried calling the night security company we checked in with sometimes. Nothing but static came back. Then all the gym lights shut off simultaneously, complete darkness. I swore out loud and nearly dropped the radio. Only the exit signs remained glowing red near the walls. The static continued. Whum! Whum! I remember feeling genuinely trapped for the first time then because the gym suddenly looked enormous in the dark. The polished floor reflected faint red emergency light across the room. And near center court, something pale moved briefly through the darkness. Not clearly enough to identify. More like distortion crossing the floor. I hit the light switches again, repeatedly. Nothing happened. The smell of overheated electronics became almost overpowering. Then I heard another sound, soft squeaking, like sneakers moving slowly across polished wood. Somewhere deeper in the gym, I stood completely still listening. The squeaking stopped immediately, then started again several feet farther away. Slow, measured. I remember backing through the doors without taking my eyes off the court. The second I entered the hallway again, the gym lights behind me snapped back on by themselves. Bright, normal. I stared through the narrow windows, expecting to finally see someone inside. Empty court, no movement. The smell faded almost instantly too. At that point, I just wanted to finish the shift and leave. I locked the gym doors and continued cleaning classrooms on the opposite side of the building. But the entire school felt wrong afterward. Too quiet. Several times I thought I heard bouncing basketballs far down the hallway, only for the sound to stop whenever I paused to listen carefully. Around 1 a.m., I realized my keys were missing. Big janitor key ring with probably 40 keys attached, plus my truck key. I checked everywhere. Classrooms, bathrooms, storage closets, nothing. I retraced my steps for nearly 20 minutes, getting more irritated than scared because losing those keys meant paperwork and probably getting written up. Finally, I went back toward the gym. The hallway lights there looked dimmer than before. Not actually failing, just pale somehow. The gym doors remained locked exactly as I left them. I unlocked one and stepped inside again. The overhead lights were still on normally this time. Everything looked ordinary. Then I saw the keys, sitting directly in the center of the basketball court, perfectly placed on the painted school logo. I stopped walking immediately. There was no chance I'd left them there accidentally. I hadn't even crossed center court after backing away earlier. And the keys were impossible to miss. Large silver ring, bright lanyard attached. I looked around the gym carefully. Bleachers empty. Equipment room closed. No movement anywhere. The smell returned faintly though. Overheated electronics. I walked slowly toward the keys. The gym lights hummed softly overhead. Every step echoed strangely. About halfway to center court, I noticed something else. The floor around the keys looked slightly fogged. Not actual fog, more like heat shimmer rising off the polished wood. I stopped again. The air felt warmer near center court, exactly like before. Then the lights flickered overhead once. The humming sound returned immediately afterward. Whum. Deeper now. I grabbed the keys quickly and backed away. The metal ring felt warm, not hot enough to burn, but noticeably warmer than it should have been. The overhead lights dimmed slightly during the next pulse. Whum. That was enough for me. I left the gym immediately and locked the doors again. While walking back through the hallway, I looked down at the keys in my hand and realized something strange. Several keys near the center of the ring were slightly bent. Not damaged badly, just warped enough that they no longer hung straight. I finished the shift sitting mostly in the custodial office, pretending paperwork needed done because I didn't want to walk the halls anymore. Right before sunrise, the vice principal arrived early for some basketball tournament setup. I mentioned the lights in the gym acting weird overnight. He frowned and told me the gym breaker panel had tripped briefly around midnight, according to the maintenance logs. That didn't surprise me until he added something else. The security cameras inside the gym recorded nothing for almost 40 minutes. Not black footage, just pale white distortion across every frame. I worked custodial nights at a high school outside Cedar Rapids for almost 2 years. Most of the job was routine. Empty trash, mop hallways, lock classrooms, deal with occasional leaks or clogged toilets. The building got eerily quiet after sports practices ended around 9 p.m., but I usually liked that part. The gymnasium sat in its own wing near the back of the school. Big place with polished wood floors, retractable bleachers, and tall windows running along the upper walls facing the faculty parking lot. At night, those windows reflected almost everything, especially during rain. This happened in February during one of those freezing sleet storms where everything outside looked wet and silver under streetlights. I was working alone that night because my supervisor had gone home sick around 8. By 11:15, the school was completely empty, except for me. I remember shutting the gym lights off myself after finishing the locker rooms. The overhead fixtures took a few seconds to power down one bank at a time, so I stood there watching the court slowly disappear into darkness before locking the side doors and heading toward the science wing. Nothing weird happened for another hour. Around midnight, I was buffing floors near the cafeteria when I noticed light reflecting across the hallway windows. At first, I thought headlights from the parking lot were sweeping through, but the light stayed steady. Bright white, way too bright for the dim security lights outside. I shut the buffer off and listened. The school immediately became silent except for distant rain hitting the roof. That's when I realized the glow came from the gym wing. I walked down the hallway slowly, expecting maybe someone had come back into the building and turned the lights on. The farther I went, the brighter the walls looked. Not yellow like gym lighting, pure white, almost colorless. The glow spilled through the narrow windows in the gym doors hard enough to reflect off the trophy cases across the hallway. I stopped about 20 feet away. No sound came from inside. No bouncing basketballs, no voices, nothing. That bothered me immediately because if somebody was in there, I should have heard something. Then I noticed the smell, faint at first, like overheated electronics. Not smoke exactly, more like a computer fan burning dust or old wiring getting too hot. The glow behind the door windows pulsed once slightly brighter. I remember thinking electrical fire again, just like anybody would. I hurried toward the doors and grabbed the handle. The second I pulled one open, the glow vanished completely. The gym beyond sat pitch dark. Only the red exit signs glowed faintly near the corners. I froze there holding the door halfway open because my eyes genuinely needed a second to adjust after the brightness. The smell remained though. Hot metal and electronics. Strong enough now that it sat heavy in the back of my throat. I reached around the wall for the light switches and turned the gym lights back on. The fixtures buzzed overhead one row at a time. Normal gym. Empty bleachers. Locked equipment cages, nothing unusual. But the smell lingered strongest near center court. I walked inside slowly, checking everywhere because I still thought maybe a ballast or electrical panel overheated. The polished floor reflected the lights, oddly though, almost hazy near the middle. Not wet, just distorted slightly like heat rising off asphalt. I remember stopping near the free throw line and realizing how quiet the room felt. Gyms normally echo even when empty. Your footsteps bounce everywhere. But that night, the sound seemed muted somehow, like the air absorbed it. Then my radio crackled loudly on my belt. Static burst hard enough to make me jump. I picked it up immediately. Nothing but low interference came through. Whum! Several seconds later again. Whum! The sound vibrated through the radio speaker more than played through it. I tried calling security downtown just to test the line. No response, only static. The smell intensified sharply during the next pulse. I turned slowly towards center court because something there looked wrong suddenly. The school logo painted on the floor reflected light differently than the rest of the gym. The wood around it seemed slightly brighter. Not glowing exactly, just pale. That's when the overhead lights dimmed all at once. Only for maybe 2 seconds. Long enough that the entire gym looked washed gray before the brightness returned. I backed toward the entrance instinctively. The humming deepened. Whum! Whum! Then I heard movement overhead. Not footsteps, more like metal creaking slowly somewhere in the rafters. I looked up. The ceiling disappeared into dark support beams far above the court lights. Nothing visible moving. Still, I had this overwhelming feeling something was suspended up there watching downward. The gym lights flickered again. Harder this time. One entire row shut off near the far bleachers. The smell of overheated electronics became almost unbearable suddenly. I remember my eyes watering slightly. Then the remaining lights went out completely. Darkness slammed into the gym instantly. Only emergency exit signs remained glowing dim red around the walls. The radio static stopped too. Total silence. I could hear my own breathing echoing softly. Then came the squeak, slow rubber sole against polished wood somewhere near center court. I froze immediately. Another squeak followed several feet away, like somebody pacing slowly in circles. I couldn't see anyone. The darkness in the middle of the gym looked thicker somehow, distorted slightly against the faint red exit light. I reached for my phone flashlight. Dead battery. Completely dead, despite charging it earlier during dinner break. The squeaking stopped, then the humming returned, suddenly louder than before. Whum. The floor beneath my boots vibrated lightly. At the exact same moment, the upper gym windows flashed bright white again. Not enough to fully illuminate the room. Just enough that for a split second I saw something tall standing near center court. Not clearly. More silhouette than shape. Long. Still. Then darkness returned immediately. I backed through the doors so fast I nearly fell into the hallway. The second the doors swung shut behind me, every gym light inside came back on simultaneously. Bright. Normal. I stared through the narrow windows expecting to see someone standing there. Empty court. No movement. The smell faded almost instantly too. I locked the doors and walked away, trying hard to convince myself exhaustion caused most of it. But halfway down the hallway, I realized my keys were gone. Large janitor ring with building masters, classroom keys, utility keys. Heavy enough you always notice them clipped to your belt. Not there. I checked every pocket twice. Nothing. At first, I assumed they fell near the cafeteria while I worked. I searched for probably 20 minutes. Nothing anywhere. Eventually, I ended up back outside the gym doors because that was the last place I clearly remembered hearing them jingle. The hallway looked dimmer now, even though the lights worked normally. I unlocked the gym reluctantly, using the backup key from the maintenance office. The gym lights were still on. Everything looked ordinary again. Then I saw the keys, sitting directly in the center of the basketball court, perfectly centered on the painted logo. I stopped breathing for a second, honestly, because there was absolutely no chance I'd drop them there accidentally. I never walked near center court after entering earlier, and the keys looked deliberately placed. Neat. Almost lined up. The smell lingered faintly again, too. Hot electronics. I stepped inside slowly. The gym lights hummed overhead. Every sound echoed wrong again. Muted. Halfway toward the keys, the radio on my belt crackled once more. Hum. The lights dimmed briefly. I grabbed the keys immediately. The metal ring felt warm. Not hot enough to burn, but warmer than it should have been. Then every basketball hanging in the storage rack along the wall shifted slightly together, not rolling out, just moving enough that the rack rattled once. That was enough for me. I left the gym, shut the doors, and finished the rest of the shift sitting mostly in the custodial office, pretending paperwork needed done. Around 5:30 that morning, the vice principal arrived early for a wrestling tournament setup. I mentioned maybe having electrical problems in the gym because lights were flickering and something smelled overheated overnight. He frowned and said the maintenance system logged a brief power fluctuation around midnight. Then he casually added something else. The motion cameras inside the gym triggered continuously for nearly 40 minutes. But when he checked the footage remotely from home, all the cameras showed was bright white distortion across the entire court. No visible person, no movement. Just white static filling the gym. I stopped at a coastal overlook outside Brookings, Oregon when this happened. I'd been driving north most of the evening after visiting a friend in Crescent City, and the weather got bad enough along the highway that I pulled over to rest for a bit before continuing. It was late October. Cold rain earlier in the night, heavy fog rolling in off the ocean, and strong wind hitting the cliffs hard enough to shake the car every few minutes. The overlook sat above a steep drop facing the water. Just a small gravel parking area with one wooden fence, a faded sign tourists probably photographed during daylight. At night, there was nothing out there except the ocean and the highway farther back through the trees. I pulled in around 1 a.m. No other cars. The fog drifted thick enough that sometimes I couldn't even see the waves below. You'd hear them crashing first, then briefly catch white water through gaps in the mist before everything disappeared again. I stayed inside the car with the heater running for maybe 20 minutes, listening to the radio and scrolling my phone. That's when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was a boat offshore, a dim white glow hovering low over the water. But after a minute, I realized it wasn't moving with the waves. It stayed perfectly still, too low to be an aircraft, too high to sit on the water itself. And there were no navigation lights blinking anywhere around it, just one dull white glow suspended out over the ocean. I rolled the window down slightly to listen. The wind outside roared immediately through the trees behind the overlook, but the strange part was the fog beneath the light. It moved differently. Everywhere else, the fog drifted sideways with the wind coming off the coast. But directly under the glow, the mist rotated slowly in circles. Not violently, just steady circular motion beneath the light itself. I remember staring at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was some weird weather effect. The farther I leaned toward the windshield, the stranger it looked. The fog patterns didn't spread outward naturally. They curled inward beneath the glow like water circling a drain. I shut the radio off without really thinking. The ocean sounded distant suddenly despite being directly below the cliffs. The wind still hit the car from behind in strong gusts, but near the overlook itself everything seemed quieter. The light remained motionless over the water. Then I noticed another sound. Low humming, barely audible under the wind. Whum. Several seconds later again. Whum. I felt it faintly through the steering wheel. The dashboard lights dimmed slightly during the next pulse. That immediately made me uncomfortable enough that I decided to leave. I put the car in gear and pressed the ignition button. Nothing. Not even clicking. The engine stayed completely dead. The battery had been fine all day. I tried again. Still nothing. The dashboard lights flickered weakly once before dimming further. Outside, the glow over the water remained perfectly still. The circular fog beneath it continued turning slowly against the direction of the wind. I grabbed my phone automatically. No signal. Battery at 3% despite being above 60 earlier while charging in the car. The humming deepened. Plum. The rearview mirror vibrated slightly during the pulse. That's when I noticed the ocean below looked wrong too. The waves farther down the coastline crashed normally against the rocks, but directly beneath the glow, the water appeared unnaturally smooth. Not flat exactly, more like the surface movement had slowed somehow. I tried starting the engine again. Nothing. The heater shut off completely. Cold air crept into the car almost immediately. Then all the sound outside faded sharply. The wind, the ocean, even the trees behind the overlook. Everything muted at once until only the humming remained. Whum! Whum! The light over the water brightened slightly, not enough to illuminate the cliffs fully. Just enough that the fog beneath it became more visible. The circular movement looked tighter now, faster. I remember realizing my own breathing sounded unnaturally loud inside the car because literally nothing else existed except that hum. Then the interior dome light switched on by itself. I hadn't touched anything. The pale glow inside the car made the windows reflect strangely. I could barely see outside, suddenly, except for the distant white light over the ocean. I looked in the rearview mirror instinctively. For half a second, I thought someone stood behind the car near the fence. Not clearly visible, just a darker shape against the fog. I spun around immediately. Nothing there. The overlook sat empty. But while looking backward, I noticed the fog inland moved normally with the wind. Only the fog beneath the ocean light rotated in circles. The humming became stronger. Not louder exactly, deeper. I could feel it in my chest now. Then the car shifted slightly, not rolling. More like becoming lighter on the suspension for a second. Loose receipts in the passenger seat lifted faintly during the next pulse. That's when real panic hit. I hit the ignition repeatedly. Nothing. The dashboard clock blinked once and went black entirely. Outside, the light moved for the first time, not towards shore, upward, slowly rising through the fog, still perfectly silent. The circular mist beneath it stretched upward too, almost following. I remember becoming intensely aware of the clouds overhead, then because the glow illuminated them faintly from underneath. The shape itself still looked undefined, not round exactly, more oval maybe, blurred at the edges every time I focused directly on it. Then I heard tapping against the passenger side window, 3 soft taps. I jerked sideways hard enough to hit the steering wheel. There was nobody there, only fog sliding across the glass, but near the bottom edge of the passenger window, condensation had formed from the cold air, and drawn through the condensation were three thin streaks, parallel, like fingertips dragged lightly upward from outside. The humming stopped abruptly. Silence hit so hard my ears rang. The glow over the ocean paused high above the water, now partially inside the clouds. Then it dimmed sharply, not fading naturally, more like disappearing layer by layer into the fog overhead. As soon as it vanished completely, sound rushed back all at once. Wind slammed against the car hard enough to rock it. The ocean roared below the cliffs again. Tree branches scraped nearby. The dashboard lights returned instantly. My radio blasted static before switching back to music. I hit the ignition again. The engine started immediately. No hesitation. Normal as ever. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing before pulling out of the overlook. As I drove back toward the highway, I checked the clock. 2:17 a.m. I stared at it because I knew I'd pulled into the overlook shortly after 1. There was no way I'd sat there over an hour. The weirdest part happened after I got home the next afternoon. The passenger side window still had faint streak marks on the outside of the glass despite rain hitting the car during the drive north. 3 long, narrow lines curving slightly upward, too evenly spaced to look accidental. I used to bike home from work along an industrial route outside Tacoma because it cut almost 20 minutes off the ride compared to staying near the main roads. The area was mostly warehouses, rail lines, and utility buildings with long empty stretches where you wouldn't see another person for blocks. One part of the route passed an electrical substation tucked behind chain link fencing near a drainage canal. Huge transformers sat inside, surrounded by warning signs and tall steel structures carrying power lines overhead. At night, the place always hummed loudly. You could hear it before you even saw the fence. Deep electrical buzzing mixed with the crackling sound high voltage equipment sometimes makes in damp air. This happened in early December. Cold night, light rain earlier in the evening, but by the time I left work, the rain had mostly stopped and fog drifted low around the industrial lots. I got off around 11:45 p.m. and started riding home like usual. The roads were almost empty except for occasional trucks near the shipping yards. I remember the fog hanging strangely low near the ground, thick enough in places that my bike light reflected back at me off the mist. About halfway home, I reached the substation road. The humming hit me immediately like always, deep electrical noise vibrating faintly through the pavement. The fence stretched along the roadside for maybe 100 yards with yellow warning signs bolted every few sections. Normally, I rode past it without thinking. That night, I noticed the humming sounded different, lower somehow, uneven, almost pulsing. Whum. Then softer buzzing again. Whum. I slowed slightly because the sound kept changing pitch. That's when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a maintenance lamp inside the substation. A dull white glow hovered just above the fence line near the center of the yard, not attached to any structure, not bright enough to illuminate the entire substation, just hanging there silently, maybe 10 feet above the chain link fence. I stopped pedaling automatically. The glow remained perfectly still. No blinking, no movement. The fog around it drifted oddly too. Everywhere else the mist moved sideways with the wind, but near the light it curled slowly upward. I remember looking around for workers or vehicles. Nothing. No trucks inside the yard. No flashlights. Just transformers and steel towers disappearing into the fog. The humming deepened again. Whum. During the next pulse, several orange security lights inside the substation dimmed noticeably. The glow above the fence brightened slightly at the same time. That was enough to make me stop the bike completely. I stood straddling it in the middle of the empty road, staring through the fence. The object looked strange because its edges kept blurring whenever I focused directly on it. Oval-shaped, maybe. Or circular. Hard to tell through the mist. I remember realizing the rainwater puddles near the curb weren't rippling anymore, despite the wind still moving through the trees overhead. Then the transformers went silent. Instantly, the entire substation. No buzzing, no electrical crackling, nothing. That silence hit hard because the humming had been constant my entire ride toward the place. Suddenly, all I could hear was distant traffic somewhere miles away and my own breathing. Even the overhead power lines stopped making noise. The glow above the fence drifted slightly closer toward the roadside. Not fast, just smooth, silent movement. My bike light flickered weakly, then dimmed almost completely. I checked the battery indicator instinctively. Dead. That made no sense because I charged it before leaving work. The street around the substation looked darker immediately without the beam. Only the dull white glow remained visible through the fog. Then came another sound, very low, almost below hearing, more vibration than noise. Hum. I felt it through the bike frame beneath my hands. The metal handlebars trembled slightly during the pulse. I backed the bike up a few feet without really deciding to. The glow moved again, closer now, hovering directly above the fence line. That's when I noticed the chain link beneath it looked wrong. The metal shimmered slightly like heat distortion rising off pavement. I remember becoming intensely aware of how empty the road felt. No passing cars, no trains, nothing moving anywhere. Then my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out. No signal. Battery at 1%. The screen brightness faded lower by itself while I watched. The glow brightened again, and the fog near the fence suddenly looked much thicker than the rest of the street. Not spreading naturally either. More concentrated around the object itself. I should have left immediately. Instead, I kept staring because the whole scene felt unreal in a quiet, believable way that made it hard to react normally. The substation transformers remained silent. That part bothered me more than anything else. Places like that are never silent. Then the glow drifted upward slightly, and every sound vanished completely. Not just the transformers. Everything. Wind. Traffic. Even the faint noise from my bike chain moving when I shifted position. Absolute silence. I looked down instinctively. The puddles beside the curb had gone perfectly still, no wind touching them anymore. Then the bike suddenly felt lighter beneath me, not floating, just less heavy somehow. The front tire lifted slightly when I adjusted my grip, even though I barely moved it. I remember my stomach dropping hard because my body recognized something was deeply wrong before my brain did. The glow remained motionless above the fence. The silence pressed so hard against my ears that they started ringing faintly. Then something moved behind the fence, not clearly visible. More like a darker shape crossing slowly between the transformers beneath the glow, tall, distorted by fog. I stared at it too long trying to understand what I was seeing, and then sound slammed back all at once. The transformers roared alive. Electrical buzzing echoed through the yard again. Wind rushed across the road hard enough to shake nearby trees. I stumbled sideways in surprise. That's when I realized I wasn't standing where I'd been before. My bike leaned against the curb several yards farther down the road, and I stood beside it with one hand still gripping the handlebars. I froze completely trying to understand how I'd gotten there, because I had absolutely no memory whatsoever of moving. 1 second, I stood facing the fence near the middle of the substation. The next, I was farther down the road beside the bike like someone had repositioned both of us. The glow still hovered above the fence behind me. But now it seemed farther away somehow. The transformers buzzed normally again. Orange security lights burned steady inside the yard. Everything looked ordinary except for the object itself. Then the glow rose upward into the fog. Slowly. No acceleration, no sound. It just drifted higher until the mist swallowed it completely. The second it disappeared, my bike light snapped back on full brightness. So bright it startled me. My phone battery jumped back to 38% too. I checked the time immediately. 1:02 a.m. I stared at the screen because it should have been maybe 12:15 at most. The ride from work to that road never took over 20 minutes. I stood there another minute, listening to the transformers humming behind the fence. Normal, now. Steady. Like nothing had happened. Then I noticed something strange on the pavement near where I'd apparently moved. There were wet shoe prints across the road leading toward the curb beside my bike, only one set. Mine. But the spacing looked wrong, too far apart, like I'd been dragged slightly between steps. I rode home as fast as I could after that. The weirdest part came later while cleaning mud off the bike in my apartment hallway. The metal handlebars felt unusually warm. Not from friction or weather, warm enough that condensation from the cold air evaporated off them in faint steam, when I touched the center bar. I worked maintenance for a freight railway yard outside Amarillo for about 4 years. Most of my shifts started before sunrise because we'd inspect switches and track sections before the morning trains rolled through. The yard stretched for miles across flat, open land with long rows of idle freight cars and maintenance sheds scattered between the tracks. At night, the place never fully slept. Engines idled in the distance. Metal clanged somewhere constantly. Radios crackled from crews switching lines farther down the yard. You got used to a constant layer of industrial noise. This happened in January during a brutal cold spell, the kind where your breath froze against your collar and every metal surface burned your skin if you touched it barehanded. I got to the yard around 4:20 a.m., still completely dark outside except for floodlights mounted on poles around the maintenance buildings. Low clouds covered the sky, and freezing fog drifted over parts of the tracks near the storage lines. My truck thermometer read 12 degrees. I parked near the tool shed, grabbed my gear, and started walking toward the east switching yard where I was supposed to inspect a signal relay issue. That's when I noticed the glow. At first, I thought it was locomotive lights reflecting through the fog. Bright, white light hovered above one of the empty track lines, maybe a quarter mile out in the yard. But it didn't move like train headlights. It stayed fixed over the rails. No beam shining outward, just pale light suspended in the darkness. I stopped walking immediately because the yard section beneath it looked strangely illuminated. Not bright exactly, more washed out. The freight cars nearby reflected dull white instead of the normal yellow floodlight color. I remember checking things for maintenance vehicles first. Nothing. No trucks, no workers, and strangely, the whole yard sounded quieter than normal suddenly. The distant engine still rumbled somewhere far off, but the closer industrial noise had faded almost completely. Then I heard the ringing, low metallic vibration coming through the tracks, not loud enough to echo, more like the rails themselves humming softly. I walked closer without really thinking because track vibration usually meant an approaching train somewhere downline, but the rails nearest me didn't vibrate normally. The steel trembled faintly in short pulses. Several seconds later again. The sound traveled through the frozen ground beneath my boots. I crouched near one rail automatically and touched it with my gloved hand. The vibration stopped instantly. The silence afterward felt wrong immediately. No wind, no clanging metal, nothing. I looked up toward the glow again. It seemed closer now, not because it moved visibly, just suddenly larger somehow above the tracks. The fog around it curled upward in slow spirals despite the wind pushing another direction across the yard. That's when the floodlights nearest the glow dimmed slightly, not fully out, just pale enough that the white object stood out more sharply. I stood up slowly. The metallic ringing returned. This time stronger. I could feel it faintly through my teeth. The rails beside me vibrated hard enough that frost shook loose in tiny white bursts along the steel. Then every yard light around that section flickered once together. The glow brightened during the flicker. I remember becoming intensely aware of how isolated that side of the yard felt. No radio chatter anymore. No nearby engines. Just rows of silent freight cars disappearing into fog. I reached for my handheld radio. Static immediately. Deep interference filled the speaker. Whum! Several seconds later again. Whum! The glow above the tracks drifted still silent. Still impossible to define clearly, oval shape maybe, or circular. The edges blurred every time I focused directly on them. I backed away a few steps instinctively. The rails continued vibrating beneath the frozen ballast. Gee. One of the freight cars farther down the line creaked loudly then, not normal metal settling either, a long drawn-out screech like weight shifting slowly inside the car. I swung my flashlight toward it. The beam looked weak instantly. Not dead battery weak, just washed out. The light barely reached halfway down the tracks. Then the flashlight dimmed completely. I smacked it against my palm. Nothing. At the same time, the ringing in the rails deepened sharply. Ging. The sound seemed to come from everywhere now. The tracks, the freight cars, even the frozen ground. I looked down. Thin frost crystals across the rails vibrated visibly during each pulse. That's when the glow moved again. Not toward me exactly, more downward. Hovering only a few feet above the tracks now. The fog beneath it rotated slowly in circles. I remember noticing there were no shadows anywhere near it. The freight cars reflected pale light across their sides, but nothing cast defined edges. Then all sound disappeared. Instantly, the ringing stopped. The wind vanished. Even my breathing sounded muted. I stood there frozen, staring at the object above the tracks. The silence pressed hard against my ears until they rang faintly. Then the rails beneath me trembled violently once. I stumbled sideways, grabbing for balance. My bare palms hit the steel accidentally because one glove slipped halfway off. The rail felt strangely warm, not hot, warm enough to feel wrong against the freezing air. At the exact moment I touched it, the glow pulsed brighter. And for half a second I thought I saw something tall standing between two freight cars beneath it. Not clearly visible. Just a narrow, dark shape against the white light. Then the world snapped back. Sound crashed into the yard all at once. Engines roaring in the distance. Wind sweeping across the tracks. Metal clanging somewhere far off. My radio crackled violently on my belt with dispatch asking if I copied. I jerked backward from the rail hard enough to fall onto the frozen gravel. The glow was gone, completely. The floodlights burned normally again. The tracks sat still beneath the fog. I checked my radio immediately. Dispatch sounded irritated, asking where I'd been for the last 40 minutes. I stared at the handset because there was no possible way that much time had passed. I looked at my watch, 5:07 a.m. I'd entered the yard shortly after 4:20. I remember sitting there on the frozen ballast trying to reconstruct what happened and coming up completely blank after touching the rail. The weirdest part came later during lunch break. I'd been working most of the morning, distracted and exhausted, assuming maybe I blacked out from cold or low blood sugar or something. Then, while washing grease off my hands in the maintenance bathroom, I noticed the marks. Thin burns across both palms, perfectly parallel lines, 3 on each hand. Not deep burns, more like narrow red welts running horizontally near the base of my fingers. They stung when water hit them. I remember staring at them because they didn't match touching a frozen rail at all. The lines were too even, too straight. That afternoon, another worker named Luis mentioned something strange while we inspected switch points near the same yard section. He asked if I'd noticed that weird light early that morning. I froze immediately and asked what he meant. He shrugged and said when he arrived around 5, several yard cameras on the east tracks were malfunctioning. White glare across the footage. He laughed about it at first until he added something else. One of the cameras briefly showed me standing motionless beside the tracks alone before the image washed completely white. He said I looked like I was staring upward at something above the rails. I worked on a wheat farm outside Great Bend, Kansas for a little over a year when this happened. Most mornings started before sunrise, especially during harvest season. The owner, Dale Mercer, liked grain levels checked before the truck started moving, so we could plan storage for the day. The farm sat miles from the nearest town. Flat land in every direction except for a line of grain silos near the equipment barn that you could see from almost anywhere on the property. This happened in early September, still warm during the day, but cold enough before dawn that your breath showed in the air. We'd had dry weather for weeks, and dust coated everything. Even the inside of the barn smelled like grain and dirt constantly. I got there around 4:40 a.m., still completely dark except for one floodlight above the equipment shed and the faint glow from the office window where Dale usually drank coffee before the crew arrived. The sky looked clear overhead, but low fog sat across some of the fields beyond the silos. I grabbed the grain hook and flashlight from the barn and headed toward the storage bins. The silos stood behind the main barn in a long row, each connected by metal conveyors and ladders running up the sides. At night, the place always made noise. Wind rattling sheet metal, grain settling inside the bins, insects buzzing around the floodlights. That morning felt strangely quiet. Not silent exactly, just muted. I noticed it halfway across the yard because my boots sounded unusually loud on the gravel. Then I saw the glow. Bright white light reflected off the side of the farthest silo, not directly from above, more like something hovering somewhere behind the structure out of view. The The curved metal surface reflected pale light across the whole yard. I stopped walking immediately, thinking somebody had arrived early with machinery headlights. But there was no engine noise, no truck, nothing moving anywhere around the silos. The reflection itself looked strange too soft around the edges, not like normal floodlights. I remember stepping sideways trying to locate the source, but every angle only showed the reflection sliding across the metal, never the actual light itself. The air felt warmer near the silos too. Not hot, just heavy, and still despite a breeze moving through the fields farther out. Then I heard the vibration, very low, almost beneath hearing. At first, I thought a grain auger had been left running underground somewhere. The sound traveled faintly through the ground under my boots. Whum! Several seconds later, again. Whum! The metal ladder attached to the nearest silo rattled softly during each pulse. That got my attention immediately, because nothing on the farm should have been running that early. I walked toward the ladder slowly, shining my flashlight around the bins. The beam looked weak. Not dead battery weak exactly, more washed out than normal. The white reflection across the silo brightened slightly during the next vibration pulse. Bum. I reached the ladder and grabbed the side rail. The metal vibrated beneath my hand. Not hard, just steady, faint trembling like massive machinery operating somewhere deep underground. That honestly unsettled me more than the light. The farm had old irrigation equipment buried around parts of the property, and my first thought was maybe something ruptured beneath the silos. But the vibration didn't feel mechanical. Too smooth, too rhythmic. I climbed a few rungs trying to see past the side of the silo toward the source of the glow. The higher I climbed, the quieter everything became. The insects near the barn stopped buzzing. The distant wind faded. Even the loose chain hanging beside the grain chute stopped clinking. Only the vibration remained through the ladder beneath my gloves. Whum, whum. When I reached maybe 15 feet up, I finally got an angle past the silo edge and saw the light. It hovered low above the ground between two storage bins farther back near the empty loading area. Dull white, oval-shaped maybe. Hard to tell because the edges blurred against the darkness. No flashing lights, no sound besides the vibration in the ladder. The fog behind it curled strangely too. Instead of drifting sideways with the breeze, it moved slowly in circles beneath the glow. I froze there, holding the ladder because my brain kept trying to make it into some piece of equipment. But there was no structure visible, no wheels, no cab, nothing. Just pale light suspended a few feet above the dirt. The vibration beneath my hands deepened slightly. Whum! The ladder trembled stronger during that pulse. I looked down automatically. Every loose piece of metal near the silo rattled faintly together. Then the flashlight dimmed almost completely. I smacked it against my palm. Nothing changed. The beam barely reached the ground now. That's when the floodlight over the equipment barn flickered. Once, then dimmed noticeably. The white glow behind the silos brightened in response. I remember becoming intensely aware of how isolated the farm felt suddenly. No nearby highway noise, no animals moving, nothing except those huge dark silos and the pale light behind them. Then all sound disappeared. Instantly. The ladder stopped rattling, the wind vanished, even my own breathing sounded distant. I gripped the rails hard because the silence hit like pressure inside my ears. The glow drifted slightly upward. Not fast, smooth and perfectly silent. And for half a second I thought I saw something standing beneath it near the loading area. Tall, narrow, darker than the surrounding shadows. I blinked hard, and it was gone. The silence continued. Then the metal ladder beneath my hands suddenly became warm. Not burning hot, just noticeably warmer than the freezing morning air. The warmth spread upward through the rails slowly during the next pulse. Whum! I could feel it directly through my gloves. That was enough to snap me out of whatever frozen state I'd fallen into. I climbed down quickly without taking my eyes off the glow. Halfway down, the vibration stopped completely. The silence broke all at once afterward. Wind rushed across the fields again. Somewhere near the barn, a loose gate slammed repeatedly. Insects started buzzing around the floodlight, and the white glow vanished, not moving away, just gone instantly. The yard looked normal again. Dark silos. Weak barn light. Nothing hovering anywhere. I stood there breathing hard, trying to process what I'd just seen. The flashlight suddenly returned to full brightness in my hand. I checked my phone immediately. No signal. battery nearly dead despite charging it before leaving home. Then I noticed Dale walking out of the office carrying coffee. He shouted asking why I'd been standing by the silos so long. That confused me because, from my perspective, maybe 10 minutes had passed at most. I checked the time, 5:37 a.m. I stared at the screen because I'd entered the yard before 4:45. There was no way nearly an hour had disappeared. The weirdest part came later after sunrise. Dale kept complaining the clocks in the barn were wrong, every single one. The office clock, the old microwave clock in the break area, even the digital timer mounted near the grain dryer. All exactly 5 minutes slow. Not random times. 5 minutes. Every one of them. The only clocks unaffected were our phones and wristwatches. I didn't say anything about the glow or the vibration because I already felt ridiculous enough. But later that afternoon, while unloading feed sacks near the silos, I noticed something else. Both palms had faint red marks running across them. Parallel lines. Thin and evenly spaced exactly where I'd gripped the ladder rails. I worked grounds maintenance for a small community college outside Wichita Falls for about 3 years. Mostly basic stuff. Mowing athletic fields, repainting lines, fixing irrigation, cleaning up after games. During football season, we spent half our lives around that stadium. The field sat behind the main campus surrounded by aluminum bleachers and tall light poles. Beyond that, there wasn't much except open land and a few maintenance buildings. This happened in late April during storm season. A thunderstorm rolled through around dusk and knocked power out across part of campus for a while. Heavy rain, lightning, strong wind. By around 10 p.m., the worst of it had passed, but everything outside stayed soaked and foggy from the humidity. I was still there because one of the drainage pumps near the football field kept failing after storms, and if water pooled too long near midfield, it wrecked the grass. Normally 2 of us handled weather checks, but the other groundskeeper left early because his kid got sick, so I ended up alone. By the time I drove the utility cart down toward the stadium, rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Wind still moved through the bleachers hard enough to make loose metal bang occasionally. The stadium lights were off, except for a few dim maintenance floods near the entrances. I remember the field looking strange immediately. Not because of the glow. At first, it was the rain. Everywhere around the stadium, the rain blew sideways with the wind. You could see it crossing through the floodlights at an angle. But over the center of the football field, the rain seemed to fall slower somehow. Not stopped, just drifting downward differently than everywhere else. I parked the utility cart beside the gate and stared for a second, trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the light. A pale circular glow hovered over midfield maybe 15 feet above the grass. Not bright enough to illuminate the whole stadium, just enough that the wet field reflected dull white beneath it. The rain falling inside that circle moved strangely. Slower, almost floating. I remember thinking maybe one of the stadium lights shorted out during the storm and created some weird reflection through the mist, but the main lights were completely dead. And there was no visible beam coming from above, just the glow itself suspended over the 50-yard line. I stepped through the gate slowly. The wet turf squished under my boots. The rain sounded loud against the bleachers and concrete walkways at first, then quieter the closer I got to the field. By the time I reached the sideline, most of the stadium noise had faded strangely. The wind still moved the flags near the top rows. I could see them, but I couldn't really hear them anymore. The glow remained perfectly still over midfield. No flickering, no movement. The rain beneath it continued drifting downward in slow motion compared to the storm around the rest of the stadium. That honestly bothered me more than the light itself. I stood there probably 30 seconds trying to force a normal explanation onto what I was seeing. Then came the humming. Low enough I felt it before hearing it. Whum! The aluminum bleachers vibrated faintly during the pulse. Several puddles near the sideline rippled outward at the same time. I looked around expecting maybe a generator kicked on somewhere nearby. Nothing. The maintenance building beyond the end zone sat completely dark. The glow brightened slightly during the next pulse. Whum. I realized then the rain inside the circle wasn't reaching the grass normally. Droplets slowed visibly before hitting the ground. Not frozen. just descending unnaturally slow. I took a few more steps onto the field despite every instinct telling me to stay back. The turf near midfield reflected the white glow strangely, too smooth, almost metallic looking through the rain. My radio crackled suddenly on my belt. Static burst loud enough to make me jump. I grabbed it immediately. Nothing but low interference. Whum. Several seconds later again. Whum. The radio vibrated faintly during each pulse. I tried calling campus security just to test the signal. No response. Only static. Then the wind stopped, instantly. Not gradually fading. Gone. The rain continued everywhere outside the stadium, but made almost no sound now. I could still see it falling through the floodlights around the bleachers. But the entire field had become unnaturally quiet. The glow drifted slightly lower over midfield, maybe 10 feet above the grass now. The rain beneath it slowed even further. I remember becoming intensely aware of my own breathing because there was literally nothing else to hear except that low humming vibration. Then my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. Battery warning. 3% remaining. That made no sense because it had been almost fully charged an hour earlier. I pulled it out anyway, intending to record the field. The camera wouldn't focus on the glow. Every time I pointed the phone toward midfield, the screen brightness dimmed automatically and the image blurred badly. Then the phone shut off completely. The humming deepened. Whum. The turf beneath my boots vibrated faintly during that pulse. I looked toward the center of the field again. For half a second, I thought I saw something standing beneath the glow. Tall and narrow, darker than the rain around it. Not clearly visible enough to identify. Then it vanished when the rain shifted. The glow lowered another few feet. The grass directly beneath it flattened slowly outward in a circle, not crushed suddenly, pressed down gently like invisible weight settling over it. That's when fear finally hit hard enough that I started backing toward the sideline. The silence around the stadium felt unbearable now. Even my footsteps sounded muffled. Then all the scoreboard lights flickered on at once behind the end zone. Bright red numbers flashed briefly through the rain. Not scores, just random segments lighting up across the board. The glow pulsed brighter immediately afterward. Whum. The bleachers rattled hard enough to echo through the stadium, and then every sound returned violently all at once. Rain hammering the metal seats, wind roaring through the open stadium, thunder somewhere distant. The sudden noise almost knocked me backward. The glow over midfield rose quickly into the rain, not shooting upward fast. Just smooth, steady movement. The rain beneath it returned to normal instantly, slamming hard against the turf. Within seconds, the pale circle disappeared into low clouds above the stadium. Gone completely. I stood there soaked and breathing hard, trying to process what I just watched. My radio crackled normally again, almost immediately. Campus security asking if I copied because they lost contact with me for nearly 40 minutes. That confused me badly because it felt like maybe 10 minutes had passed at most. I checked my watch. 11:38 p.m. I'd entered the stadium shortly after 10:45. The next morning, things got stranger. I came back early with another groundskeeper named Mitch to inspect storm damage. The rain had stopped overnight and fog still hung low over parts of the field. The grass at midfield was flattened in a perfect ring, maybe 20 feet across. Not dead. Not burned. Just pressed down evenly in a clean circle surrounding untouched grass in the center. No tire marks, no footprints leading in or out. Mitch thought maybe one of the tarps blew loose during the storm until he walked into the ring. Then he stopped and frowned. I asked what was wrong. He pointed downward. The grass inside the circle felt warm, not hot, just noticeably warmer than the rest of the field despite the cold, wet morning air. I worked as a medical courier for about a year in Missouri, mostly overnight deliveries between hospitals and testing labs, blood samples, paperwork, medication containers, stuff like that. The routes usually took me through long stretches of farmland before sunrise when almost nobody else was on the roads. This happened in late April. I remember because storms had rolled through earlier that night, leaving the roads wet and fog hanging low across the fields. My shift started around midnight in Columbia, and by about 3:30 a.m. I was driving north toward a small clinic outside Moberly. The roads out there were empty, just narrow two-lane highways cutting through farmland and patches of woods with occasional mailboxes or grain silos appearing out of the dark. I relied completely on GPS during those routes because a lot of the county roads looked identical at night. That morning, the fog kept thickening the farther north I drove. Not dense enough to hide the road completely, but enough that headlights only reached maybe 50 yards ahead before fading into gray. Everything felt normal until I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was farm equipment working early, a bright white glow low over a field off the left side of the road, but as I got closer, it became obvious something about it looked wrong. The light wasn't attached to the ground. It hovered above the field maybe 20 feet up, not bright enough to fully illuminate the crops below, just pale white suspended in the fog, completely still. I slowed down automatically, no tractor noise, no floodlights, nothing except the glow hanging low over the field. Then came the humming, low, barely audible through the van engine. Whum! I felt it faintly through the steering wheel. Several seconds later again, whum! The dashboard GPS screen flickered slightly during the pulse. I glanced down automatically, signal bars dropping, then the route map froze completely. The second GPS mounted near the windshield did the same thing at almost the exact same time. No signal. I remember feeling an immediate unease then because losing GPS out there wasn't normal. Cell service maybe, but not both systems at once. Whum! The pulse came stronger this time. The radio cut briefly to static, and the pale glow over the field brightened enough that the fog around it reflected dull white. The weirdest part was the field itself. The grass beneath the glow moved in circles despite completely still air. I could see long patches flattening outward from the center beneath the hovering light. No wind touched the roadside trees around me, no branches moving anywhere. Only the field shifted beneath the glow. I kept driving, but slower now. The glow remained level with the van for several seconds, even as the road curved, sometimes partially hidden by fog, sometimes fully visible again between fence posts. Then the road noise started fading. At first I thought the tires changed pavement surfaces, but within another minute, everything sounded muted somehow. The engine softened, the rainwater hissing beneath the tires disappeared, even the windshield wipers sounded distant. Whum! The vibration deepened. Loose pens in the cup holder rattled softly during the pulse, and both GPS screens shut off completely. Black, not frozen. Dead. I checked my phone quickly. No signal. Battery at 1%, even though it had been plugged into the charger since midnight. The screen dimmed almost black before I locked it again. The glow over the field drifted slightly closer toward the road. Still perfectly smooth motion, still no visible source inside it. The fog beneath it rotated slowly upward now. Not natural wind movement, more like smoke circling a drain. Then I noticed something farther out in the field. Dark vertical shapes standing motionless beneath the fog. At first I thought fence posts, but they were too tall, too narrow, and one of them shifted position slightly while I watched. Whum! The pulse hit harder. The van headlights dimmed noticeably for maybe half a second. At the same moment, every sound vanished. Complete silence. No engine, no tires, nothing. The van still moved forward normally down the road, but the silence felt impossible, like driving underwater. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped. The glow outside the field brightened further, and for 1 second I thought I saw the road ahead reflecting pale white even though there were no streetlights anywhere nearby. The silence continued. I could hear only my own breathing. Then the humming became continuous. Mum. The steering wheel vibrated faintly beneath my hands. The fog ahead thickened suddenly across the road, and the glow beside the field moved closer. Near enough now that pale light reflected off the passenger mirror. That's when the van engine sputtered once. Not enough to stall, just brief hesitation. The headlights dimmed nearly out again, and for maybe 1 second, I thought the van wasn't touching the road properly anymore. Not floating exactly, just unnaturally smooth. The sensation disappeared immediately afterward. Mmm. The continuous vibration filled the whole cab now, and outside the side window, the dark shapes in the field looked closer than before. Still motionless, still impossible to identify clearly through the fog. Then all the sound returned at once. Engine roaring, tires hissing on wet pavement, wind buffeting the van. The sudden noise made me flinch hard enough to jerk the wheel slightly. The glow remained over the field maybe another few seconds. Then it rose silently upward into the fog and disappeared completely. Gone. The GPS screens rebooted immediately afterward. Maps reloading, signal bars returning. I remember looking down, expecting the route to continue normally. Instead, both systems showed me miles west of where I should have been. Different road entirely. According to the map, I'd somehow turned onto County Road H, nearly 20 minutes earlier. I had absolutely no memory of turning anywhere. None. I pulled onto the shoulder and checked the time. 4:26 a.m. Nearly 45 minutes missing. The strangest part happened when I finally reached the clinic. While unloading containers from the back of the van, I noticed dried mud splashed across the passenger side panels, almost up to the windows. Dark streaks mixed with flattened pieces of wet grass, as if I'd driven partly through a field without realizing it.